has started.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good night for you all. Welcome to the International Conference on Architecture between Autonomy and Engagement. The International Conferences on Architectural Criticism are being held every year since 2021. Its creation was proposed by Professor Wilfried Wang, and they have been organized with participation of many members of the International Committee of Architectural Critics, SICA. SICA brings together critics, theorists, and historians from all over the world. The members of SICA share the conviction that criticism and the theoretical discourse of architecture are integral parts of the architectural processes. SICA and its members' aim is to work alongside architects and other professionals towards a better architecture and better cities. Following the International Conferences on Architectural Criticism in 2021, on architectural quality in 2022, on architecture as built criticism in 2023, this year's conference debates how realized buildings stand in the autonomy and engagement debate. The conference is held online. It comprises 4 online sessions to allow the participation of people in every continent. We are in the 3rd session today. Each session is opened by a lecture from a distinguished guest, followed by the presentation and debate of 4 papers per session. This year's call for papers received around 80 propositions from 3 continents. As it happened in the previous conferences, the lectures and the papers will be published in a book to be edited next year by Park Books from Switzerland. The sessions are being recorded and will be published online after the conference. In this year's conference, we have introduced a new feature. Due to the seniority of 2 of our distinguished guests, namely today's guest, Alvaro Siza, and previous week, Denise Scott Brown, their testimonies on the theme of autonomy and engagement have been recorded in exclusive videos and will be presented by the SICA colleagues that personally visited and interviewed them. In the sections, we also had the presence of architect Nzinga Mibop from Dakar, and tomorrow's sessions we will receive Rosanna Hu and Lyndon Neri from Shanghai. In the name of the organizing committee, I'd like to thank all the scientific committee colleagues, all the participants, and most especially our very dedicated support team. Now I give the floor to Professor Ana Tostões from Portugal for her opening remarks as chair of the sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm starting, and I would say that Siza represents, in my point of view, an exemplary case of disciplinary autonomy and social engagement. The project as a permanent search for space, form, light, and expression. For him, every project is an opportunity to create ab initio, like the craft of a painter or a sculptor. Each commission is a motto for searching for beauty, for looking at the landscape, the city, the trees, the birds, the trains, the people who will inhabit it, and living architecture as a container for life. That's why his production is so unique, because it's made with the deep engagement with people, with people's lives, and the awareness of the future and of architecture power to transform. With an awareness of the hope and of memory, with an imagination capable of inspiring the senses, always knowing and honoring the importance of returning to and thinking about the origin of things. With humility and enthusiasm, in this conference he will share with us a lifetime of work inspired by a constellation of authors he admires, and where he has rightly sought a sense of architecture's autonomy and disciplinary engagement, because one must not forget that architecture is the most social of the arts. When we asked him to choose and have a talk with us about his favorite building, he replied with 28 works and 28 authors, narrating and sharing with us the inspiration of a lifetime, as he says, without a special component, the enthusiasm, there is no architecture. Narrating and sharing with us his admiration for many other architects, colleagues in their trade, sharing the challenges, the stimuli, the impact of each one had on his creative process. A lesson simultaneously in glory and grace, but also in humble curiosity, made up of the wisdom of those who want to learn deeply, with an inexhaustible curiosity, with a permanent restlessness. With us, with you, Siza, has the stage for our pleasure, I'm sure of it. I'd like to thank Ruth Verdesign and Carlos Eduardo Comas for organizing this fourth SICA conference, taking care of all the details with our president, Wilfried Wang, and to, as well, to find this challenge to have with us Denise Scott-Brown and Alvaro Siza, so that we could be together now in at least 4 continents, I think, and for the challenge of including Siza in SICA's thinking board. I must thank Serralves Foundation and Museum in the person of the fantastic president, Ana Pinho, and our friend, António Chopina, the curator of the exhibition on display in the new wing of Serralves entitled the Casa Collection, an exhibition that will soon be on display in Shanghai, with whom it was possible to make this record and put it on video. SICA welcomes Siza with pride and commitment as its first honorary SICA member. Siza and his untouchable passion for architecture. With you, the great master Siza, in the inspiring atmosphere of Serralves, to celebrate the theme of autonomy, engagement, and today, housing.
No sound? We are not hearing the sound?
Favorito. E interpretei como meu, como para mim. E, portanto, não indiquei nenhum edifício meu. Nem acho que houvesse lugar para isso. A realidade é que não há um edifício favorito, não pode haver. Pensei, esforcei, mas não consegui, com convicção, mencionar um edifício favorito. Em geral, e muito menos meu, porque com mais direta informação e recordação.
Porque se hace
Para começar, terei que esperar que comunicar-vos que não me interessava nada pela arquitetura. Concretamente, não queria ser arquiteto. Queria ser escultor. Isto porque não havia nada na minha vida até então. Entrei na escola em 49, nada que me aproximasse da arquitetura. E, portanto, o início foi um cálculo para, sem grandes problemas, mudar da arquitetura para a escultura, inscrevendo-me em arquitetura como era mais tolerado pelos meus pais, pela família, e porque a arquitetura era mais respeitada, um pouquinho mais respeitada do que as outras artes. Mas aí que entrei com a firme convicção de ir mudar e sem saber nada em absoluto sobre arquitetura. Mas o clima na escola era ainda uma certa frustração. Encontrava muitas dificuldades. Estava latente a ideia peregrina em relação a Portugal, neste caso, do estilo nacional. E havia uma vontade de modernidade, impulsionada também por casos como o fim da Guerra Mundial, portanto, o fim de apoios ao regime de má memória, com a euforia do fim da guerra, muita publicação, novas revistas de arquitetura, publicações de livros, a recuperação das cidades destruídas, portanto, uma grande euforia, um grande entusiasmo e grandes ideias. Sendo assim, também no Porto há um grupo de arquitetos jovens que o Carlos Ramos muito bem escolhe e que, tal como a geração anterior já, criam a modernidade, criam essa coisa difícil, então, a contemporaneidade. E começaram a lutar por isso, e com o tal fim da guerra e outras coisas em paralelo, por exemplo, a decisão de Calouste Gulbenkian de instalar a sede em Lisboa. A Gulbenkian era chamada por nós como Ministério da Cultura de Portugal, e o início de coisas como viagens, bolsas de estudo, para pintores, escultores e arquitetos, os estudantes da Escola de Belas Artes. Eu lembro-me que a primeira experiência vinda dessa ação da Fundação Gulbenkian foi uma visita a Paris, do ano em que se fazia uma exposição que ocupava tudo como era galerias ou museus de Paris, onde fomos estudantes, alguns professores, vimos o Picasso todo, ou não, porque não tinha fim, mas vimos também a nova arquitetura em Paris. Vimos o que era já um mito na Faculdade de Arquitetura e que resumia e em que se concentrava essa ideia da modernidade, Le Corbusier. Praticamente moderno era Le Corbusier. Só depois começaram a aparecer com essa maior divulgação, começar Portugal a receber publicações que não recebia. Nunca falhou a arquitetura do Juduí, mas foi a única. Bom, eu sempre um ignorante completo. Depois tive uma coisa fundamental para mim, foi a primeira correção feita pelo mestre Carlos Ramos, no segundo ano. Sentou-se com aquele ritual acostumado, que era talvez olhar e pensar o que dizer, enrolar numa rotalha um cigarro, puxar, cortar as pontas, acender o cigarro. E então começava a falar. E o que me disse? Disse-me, eu não vou fazer a crítica ao seu trabalho, porque olhando para o que tenho aqui, vejo que não faz a menor ideia do que seja a arquitetura, nem moderna, nem antiga. E depois deu-me um conselho. Vá a uma livraria, compre umas revistas de arquitetura, livros, silvério, e depois tornamos a falar, passado algum tempo. E aconselho a arquitetura do Júlio. Lá fui, um nessa altura acontecia. Eu tinha, na altura, 16 anos, com o meu pai, à livraria onde o meu pai comprava os livros que necessitava de engenharia, era engenheiro. E tive uma sorte incrível, porque o que é que havia lá das 72 Juvenil? Crópios, em que já tinha ouvido falar, porque Carlos Ramos era um oceano puro. Neue, que gostei muito, olhando a revista. Um número sobre hospitais, que me assustou tanto que acho que nem abri, ou abri só, que eram edifícios enormes, complexíssimos e tal. E, finalmente, Alvaro. Eu não sabia, não imaginava quem era esse tal Alvaro, e era ainda pouco conhecido. Começou depois a ser conhecido. Quer dizer, na Península Ibérica já tinha passado pelo oceano com grande notoriedade, e eu senti o mesmo, provavelmente, com outro conhecimento e profundidade, tinham sentido os membros do oceano. Encantamento, maravilha. E quando vejo edifícios como o ondulado MIT de Massachusetts, ou o pavilhão de Nova Iorque, da exposição de, acho que 37, também com a parede ondulada e tal. Esta menção das curvas pode parecer uma superficialidade e um pouco suspeita, mas não era só as curvas. No MIT, além das curvas, havia aquelas paredes em tijolo sólidas, a distribuição das aberturas e entrando, então, uma maravilha. Nós tivemos a seguir uma outra bolsa de estudo para ir a Estocolmo e à Finlândia. E aí pudemos ver diretamente muita coisa da obra de Alvaro, o Paimio, o grande edifício, não sei de que sindicato ou coisa assim, a tijolo também, casas. Estivemos com ele, estivemos na pequena casa feita em 37 e num maravilhoso ateliê com o pátio. E falamos com ele. E depois fomos ver outras obras, Sanatório Paimio, fora de Helsínquia, algumas. Portanto, estes dois choques. Ainda não estou à altura das imagens. Eu peço desculpa, mas começo a falar disto e perco-me, porque é um mundo de memórias. O seguinte choque, portanto, Corbusier, Alvaro, choque. Mas há outro choque, porque eu encontro na livraria o Hitchcock, e compro. E não sei que começo a saber que há um arquiteto, Frank Lloyd Wright. E o que é que me impressiona mais tarde, agora dando um salto, tive a oportunidade, quando estive os tempos, na Universidade de Harvard, dar uma volta pelo interior e tal, e então havia a Casa da Cascata e na mesma altura, um pouco depois, vejo um desenho, Casa da Cascata, quem chega à parte alta, depois deve-se para entrar. A casa parece uma casa muito grande, mas quando a gente se aproxima, põe a mão assim e toca na padieira da porta lá e no teto do átrio. E mesmo na sala comum, se puserem em pé, já quase que toca no teto. E é uma sala grande, porque o balanço entre as dimensões nos percursos, estão bem calculados, dão outra noção de dimensões, de escala, de tudo. No meio disto, ia tomando nota das influências, destes aspectos do cruzamento de culturas, das influências estendidas, multiplicadas, cruzadas, e do Wright no Japão, o que trouxe do Japão, o que depositou do Japão, o mesmo Corbusier, na América do Sul, pela América do Sul. Enfim, isto multiplicado e recebendo de quando em quando, no meu conhecimento, outros aportes, outras contribuições. A arquitetura, este mundo de relacionamento, não só local, mas relacionamento internacional, sem o que a arquitetura nunca teria sido o que é, o que foi de há tanto tempo. Porque esta coisa dos contactos não depende só das comunicações células. Hoje em dia o avião vai num instante, não, porque já aconteceu na Idade Média, no Renascimento, no Barroco. O Barroco chegou ao Brasil e por aí fora, em caravela, com pedras numeradas e depois montadas aí. Portanto, isto é um velho aspecto do que é a arquitetura, este relacionamento. De alto, lembro-me de ter visto com especial atenção, atração, a fábrica de Sunila, que surge gravada. Podemos passar agora e vou dando saltos. Não, é este, com estes saltos não vejo nada. Gravada nas rochas, a rocha natural, com algumas pancadas, umas lascas a sair, como um material da arquitetura, como faziam há quantos séculos os maias. Muito mais tarde, muitos anos mais tarde, visitei a Maison Carré. E, de novo, agora o encantamento que já tinha surgido em Viipuri, mas que eu não visitei. Viipuri era já fora da Finlândia. Portanto, esses tetos ondulados, as escadas, a maneira como se articulava tudo, as dimensões todas do edifício, e como o percurso era acompanhado por diferenças de altura, diferenças na cor. Portanto, em obras como esta se aprende muito. Quem quiser abrir os olhos, prestar atenção. Ora, a seguir, o que é que vem aí? Isto é outra coisa. Eu trabalhei aqui nos anos 70, a partir de 74, num programa chamado SAL, do qual foi um programa que marcou para toda a vida, em que vi como era possível, natural, falar com toda a gente, primeiro sobre a casa, eram chamados programas participados, mas em pouco tempo, naquela vertigem que caracterizou o 25 de abril de 74, passou para a discussão da cidade. Foi o fim do sol. Compreenderam que a cidade era um todo. E os debates passaram a ser sobre a cidade. Já se tinha ultrapassado coisas comezinhas e variáveis, como seja, que contaram muito na parte inicial, a relação ótima, desejada, por aquele tipo de pessoas, entre a sala e a cozinha. Não era isso, era a cidade. Quando toca na cidade, toca em muitos interesses. E por isso rapidamente acabou. O SAL durou 2 anos, em que se trabalhou muitíssimo, mas com um entusiasmo, porque acontecia o que um arquiteto necessita que aconteça. Sem isso, a arquitetura é das mais aborrecidas profissões. É o entusiasmo. Trabalha-se para estas pessoas com entusiasmo. E que está bastante em crise no momento atual. Tive a sorte de encontrar o entusiasmo na China e na Coreia, o que, entre outras coisas, e no Japão também agora, entre outras coisas, impediu que fechasse o escritório por impossibilidade. Mas isto já não vem a propósito, porque eu estava a falar total, já estava muito longe. É brutal, mas sobre o sol. O resultado para os arquitetos, não muito, que decidiram com entusiasmo ou a convite para participar nestes programas. No meu caso, foi o convite dos estudantes que já tinham feito trabalho naquela primeira associação, que era São Vítor, que era ao pé da escola. E foram os estudantes que me vieram convidar. Mas depois houve quem dissesse que eu não servia para aquilo porque trabalhava para a burguesia e, portanto, não podia compreender o que estava em questão. Ao que eu respondi que estava particularmente bem preparado, porque quando se trabalha para uma família burguesa, um prédio burguês, uma moradia, é preciso falar com o dono, com a mulher, com os filhos já estão capazes disso, com a sogra, com o vizinho, com os amigos mais chegados. Portanto, aí é diálogo, e é diálogo às vezes tão difícil como seria no início o diálogo com os moradores das ilhas. E, portanto, eu estava treinado para isso. E acabei por ser aceito, trabalhei esses 2 anos com muita gente, alguma está aqui, por exemplo, a de Alberto Dias, foi um dos que me convidaram, o Moura, a Teresa Fonseca, etc. Isso valeu-me, e a outros arquitetos que trabalhavam no sol, a marginalização absoluta e não ter trabalho. Teve um aspecto bom, porque, no fundo, há quem encontrar sempre o bom do mal. O SAL teve muita repercussão, este programa, na Europa. Porque na Europa acontecia o mesmo interesse pela mudança na cidade, na forma de encarar a cidade. E havia uma movimentação política muito forte. E nessa, o tema da participação dos moradores, dos projetos, era um tema forte, que aliás enchia as revistas de arquitetura. Modo que o sol interessou. A Revolução interessou. A maior parte dos arquitetos que eu conheci na altura, não a ti, mas muitos arquitetos italianos, franceses e de outros países ainda, mas sobretudo italianos e franceses, vieram ver a Revolução, mas descobriram aí que também havia arquitetura em Portugal. Isso foi o motivo dos convites que aconteceram de imediato. Portanto, fiquei sem trabalho aqui, abriram-se portas, primeiro em Berlim e a seguir na Holanda, para problemas que tinham alguma relação. Sobretudo, uma já em prática posição em relação aos imigrantes. Em Berlim, estavam, na altura, ainda 100.000 turcos que haviam ocupado uma zona junto ao muro do iceberg, e onde estava um diretor muito empenhado na conversa, na participação dos moradores, turcos também. Mas já aí começou a haver reações. Eu lembro de estar na rua, a polícia e tal, de bancada e tal. Eu não me lembro agora do nome do diretor, Hammer era uma pessoa extraordinária, mas foi uma experiência de trabalho muitíssimo interessante. E Hammer era a voz da necessidade da cidade, do entendimento com os imigrantes que aí viviam, tinham feito a sua reconstrução e que eram habitantes de Berlim, já de pleno direito, julgo eu. E, portanto, em Berlim, tive o contacto com esse aspecto. Era chamada IVA pobre, depois havia a IVA rica, que era mais em terrenos livres, envolvendo arquitetos de todo o mundo, havia americanos, havia... Eu conheci a maioria dos arquitetos estrangeiros, primeiro no Sol, depois em Berlim, depois na Holanda, mas sobretudo em Berlim. Em Berlim esse programa IVA, com que agregava, que é um programa que periodicamente acontece. Convidavam gente de todo o mundo e tal, havia encontros, conversas, debates e tal. Conheci aí também muitíssimos arquitetos, sobretudo os americanos, que não tinham vindo da São Vitor ou São Paulo. Bem, o Bruno Taut foi outro choque, outra paixão. Da dura, como lhe chamam, toda a habitação social, de que visitei ainda parte em Berlim Leste. Já se podia ir de comboio, com muitas dificuldades. Na sequência, passando agora para não ser, já estou a ser muito longo demais, passando à Holanda, eu pude ver Doiker, maravilhoso sanatório de Doiker, e os outros arquitetos dessa época. E no mesmo passeio, Escola de Amsterdã. Que para aqui uns vídeos. Bom, impressionou-me. Bem, primeiro foi outra viagem maravilhosa em que vi toda a qualidade e o Versum, o museu de Haia, etc. Foi ótima viagem em que repesquei um antigo estudante com que depois que tinha ido para a Holanda, que depois passei a trabalhar com ele até hoje. O Carlos Castanheira, que tinha ido para a Holanda e que já dominava, conhecia tudo, tinha automóvel e, portanto, fiz muitas visitas. Mas uma coisa que me impressionou, daí eu fiz um conjunto de habitação social, dizem, social é toda, não é? Social pode ser uma forma mais elegante de dizer quem vive mal. O que é que eu estava a dizer com esta parte? Tá bom. Eu fiz a habitação social, fiz em tijolo. E porque os holandeses trabalham como ninguém, o tijolo, trabalhavam e julgo que continuam a trabalhar. E verifiquei que o tijolo é um material que melhor envelhece, de todos. Pedra, ou seja, o que for. Quanto mais trabalhado pelo tempo, mais belo é, porque, ao contrário dos outros, mármore que seja, a menos que seja cuidadosamente limpo e tal, nem toda a gente faz. E agora, dando outro salto, aqui para trás, queria contar quando apareceu o arquiteto Tábora, debaixo do braço, com um livro chamado Brasil Builds. Abriu o livro e começou a explicar, falar sobre ele. E aí está outro choque fulminante, a tal ponto que Niemeyer, sobretudo, o Hadid, a tal ponto que todos os estudantes, todos, mudaram completamente a representação gráfica dos trabalhos, que antes eram com as paredes de 30 centímetros, pintadas de preto, com pilares, com um diâmetro aconselhável, e assim, e passaram a ser, como os desenhos pequenos agora, é que nos enchiam de dançar, pilares, um ponto, paredes, umas reitas, e formas belíssimas. Mais tarde, voltando outra vez mais tarde, quando tive trabalho no Brasil, conheci, já tinha conhecido, porque tinha estado cá na Escola de Belas Artes, na altura em que fazia aí os projetos para Portugal. Só feito uma madeira magnífica, um hotel, não está agora muito bem trabalhado. Mas ele convidou-me, depois que eu tive várias vezes, fui várias vezes, ia sempre no Rio de Janeiro. Convidou-me, não, propuseram-me uma conversa com ele no teatro, perto daquele museu, como é que se chama aquela zona do Alto, do outro lado? Niterói, porque aquele grande anfiteatro que estava por acabar, não estava tapado, não estava fechado. A Casa da Cascata é algo extraordinário. A gente chega a uma cota um bocadinho mais alta, desce de estas formas e a casa é composta pelo exterior e pelo interior, ambos envolventes. E depois há um piso em baixo. E passei aí uma tarde à conversa com Niemeyer, que se apresentava com paletó branco impecável. Em boa forma, deveria ter 99 anos, ou coisa assim. E pronto, e aí tive o prazer e o gosto de estar com ele uma tarde inteira. Ora, o que é que eu tenho a seguir para acabar? É preciso que é Barragán. Bom, mais um show. Barragán. Fui convidado para ir a Bogotá e tive para o México e tive a oportunidade de visitar várias obras com o arquiteto local, belíssimo, várias obras. E tenho aqui umas fotografias impressionaram-me todas. A seguir, falando do Barragán, portanto, o tratamento da luz como material da arquitetura é magistral, a cor é muitas vezes exageradamente tomada com o caráter mais importante de Barragán e não é assim. Aliás, eu conheço a história das torres que ele construiu no México, em que volta e volta é preciso pintá-las. E há discussões infindáveis entre os arquitetos, porque uns acham que é o rodo, outros acham que é o muque e tal, não sei. E a verdade é que o Barragán, periodicamente, mesmo a casa dele, escolhia outra cor, pintava outra coisa. Não que era um debate sem saída, porque havia sempre ideias contrárias. Visitamos também a casa, que é maravilhosa, e a relação com o jardim pequeno, o mobiliário, é tudo de uma qualidade extraordinária, intocável, não é? Portanto, realmente a gente vem à regra. Outro encontro, tudo isto já não era bolsas de estudo, mas viagens de trabalho, em que aproveitava sempre que podia para ir ver coisas. E quando tive trabalho na Califórnia, fui ver o Salk Institute do Cannes. E vem bem a seguir ao Barraga. O Cannes faz aquela obra, mas tão extraordinária. E realmente já não se consegue olhar para o Salk Institute sem ver aquele sul. Depois lá no fundo, uma pequena fonte, vê-se o mar, é voltada a poente, a luz, aquela zona extraordinária, e pronto, foi outra viagem em que aprendi alguma coisa. E agora uma coisa leve, porque já vai há muito tempo isto, algo doméstico. Mas que nem estou a trazer aqui, porque uma das coisas que vem de resto neste papel que li sobre alternativa autonomia ou relacionamento da arquitetura. E como tu disseste, já as duas coisas são o mesmo. É arquitetura, simplesmente. Não há uma coisa e outra. Excepcionalmente, já falarei nisso, pode haver razões para encarar esta complementaridade de forma ligeiramente diferente, um pouco diferente. Mas aqui temos um edifício completamente autónomo, tão autónomo que atravessou o Adriático, no fim, foi com um grande espanto dos pescadores que jogavam, era algum homem, ou coisa assim, com a companhia de teatro dentro, foram dar um espetáculo do outro lado do Adriático. No entanto, quando eu nesta viagem, por acaso fiquei num hotel em frente mesmo disto, ao pé de São Marcos, e o teatro era uma parte pioneira, já não era uma coisa temporária, uma feira da Bienal, mais coisa da Bienal. Não, era parte pionera. Portanto, aqui é a prova mais completa de como não são coisas diferentes, a autonomia e a convergência, enfim, o relacionamento. É também um dos aspectos da arquitetura. É claro que há que pôr uns programas, o que é um programa. Pode haver posições especiais, não é? Por exemplo, não é o mesmo fazer uma casa a compor, a participar no tecido da cidade, tecido habitacional, e um edifício público, um edifício da Câmara, uma igreja, ou que seja. O que e acontece muitas vezes, um pouco aflitivo, é quando se pretende de uma parte de um contexto urbano emergir de uma forma particular. É uma casa, no meio de muitas casas, não é? Ou, como também assisti uma vez numa apresentação, um edifício público, naquele caso era um edifício de Câmara, subdividido, fragmentado, para, dizia o arquiteto, quebrar a escala da cidade. As duas coisas deixam fora. Pode passar a outra. Não. Aí sim, é isso. Agora, exatamente. Eu, o Lócio e o Gregotti não tinham um relacionamento fantástico, mas eram os dois figuras extraordinárias da cultura italiana no campo da arquitetura. Um muito ligado à história, os temas eram a tipologia, mas o que eu notava mais era uma ligação à história. Os olhos do Rossi atravessando a Itália e como sacada daquilo, não cópias, mas num sei que espírito que vai para além do tempo e que ele apresentava no mais pequeno edifício. E o mesmo quando trabalhava noutros países também, trabalhou também em Portugal. Foi um dos que vieram, e o Gregotti já conhecia, mas o Rossi veio com o som, lembro perfeitamente disso. Bom, o Gregotti é convidado para fazer um Centro Cultural de Belém no momento em que estava no poder a direita. E faz este projeto e as críticas são tremendas. Algumas críticas tremendas. Censurava-se, por exemplo, o atrevimento de pôr o edifício na direção do ângulo de Jerónimo, provavelmente o mais importante monumento português, não é? A celebração das poetas, o que é. E também a dimensão do edifício. Eu, na altura, fiquei aborrecido com o que se disse sobre o Centro Cultural de Belém. Depois passou, não é justo estar a funcionar bem há muitos anos. Funcionou bem quando foi da Comunidade Europeia. Veio aqui a Comunidade Europeia que não funciona muito bem. Não é culpa do Gregotti, eu acho que... E chamei a atenção e fiquei um bocado irritado com aquilo. Escrevi um pequeno texto, não sei para que revista de arquitetura, em que dizia o seguinte: ora, a anterior, a barbaridade apontada com o convento dos Jerónimos, ou desta ligação, deste alinhamento, a parte de um equívoco. E chamei ao artigo Outro Italiano em Portugal. Aquela parte dos Jerónimos.
Hablando del museo que hace Gregotti al lado de los Jerónimos y que le acusan de barbarismo, que
por um cenógrafo italiano, cujo nome de momento não me lembro, mas é Shinati. Não há como a memória da juventude. Bom, e que fez o hotel do Botaco, famoso, que era o hotel de caça do rei Dom Carlos, e que o rei gostou tanto do trabalho dele, fez também não sei o que em Lisboa, mas era na Tostões, sabe, e ele gostou tanto que convidou para fazer esta parte da coisa. E, portanto, não havia nada de sacrílego nesta parte. A parte da direita é que é boa e belíssima do convento. Não, há outra coisa. Bem, e assinalava também a leitura da cidade de Lisboa, feita pelo Gregotti, que não se enganava nestas coisas, porque Lisboa é feita de miudeza, pequena escala, etc. E de repente aparece um grande volume, convento, ou palácio, ou que seja. E, portanto, a certeza na leitura da cidade onde trabalha. Finalmente, isto que é o final, podem estar sossegados. Ainda há dois, mas isto é Venturi. Eu não falei, mas para não ser mais longo ainda, mas estas experiências de visita a edifícios, conversas com arquitetos, com gente de outros países e não arquitetos, é acompanhada também por um contacto com livros que aparecem. E alguns que me faltaram este contato com os livros. Gideon. E logo Zerbi. O primeiro livro que apareceu na escola foi Gideon. Só mais tarde, um estudante que vinha de Itália trouxe o Zevi e publicou, juntamente com um grupo, incluía também o Tábora e outros, publicavam-se opúsculos e publicam uns fragmentos do Gideon e depois também do Zevi. Nós então descobrimos o Zevi e o que de novo havia do Zevi. E depois havia partidos, havia não, o Zevi não, o Gideon sim, houve discussão e, portanto, animou-se esta parte de informação colhida através da literatura. Depois disso veio o Baleri e depois veio o Tafuri, isto já muito mais tarde. E depois, em determinada altura, estava eu, tinha começado a frequentar uma coisa que se fundou em Barcelona, que eram os pequenos congressos, onde se juntavam arquitetos, alguns, era por convites, todas as regiões de Espanha, e que teve uma grande influência na tomada de posição rápida, mal, constrangimento político, diminuiu ou desapareceu. E onde eram como principais personagens mais experientes o Gregotti e o Federico Correia. E depois gente nova, o Oscar Tosquete, não me lembro agora, mas enfim, gente que depois, com a mudança política, teve acesso a trabalho e fez, por exemplo, o sucesso dessa realização que foi as Olimpíadas de Barcelona. Portanto, esses livros tiveram. Bom, e quando estava nessa coisa, chegavam alguns dos espanhóis catalães uma viagem à América e trazem um livro que acabara de aparecer, que era Complexity and Contradiction, e oferecem um livro. E eles vinham entusiasmadíssimos. E eu, entusiasmado, fiquei, e é um grande livro do Venturi. E pus aqui uma obra que visitei dele, que é A Casa da Mãe, com os interiores magníficos, esta escada, a lareira ali e tal. E depois visitei outros, mas esta, particularmente, esta de pequena escala e tal, entusiasmou. Porque os arquitetos não são, também fez obra grande, não é? Os arquitetos não são especialistas. No melhor dos casos, são especiais. Portanto, tem que treinar, aprender na pequena escala, numa grande escala. Quem não se interessou, estudou o problema de um edifício de grande escala, um monumento, etc., não pode fazer, já não pode fazer bem uma casa, uma casinha. E da mesma maneira, quem não fez uma casa não pode fazer bem um edifício monumental. Em princípio, talvez tenha exagerado, mas a ideia é esta, da complementaridade, quer no aspecto que falamos anteriormente, a autonomia, a inserção, quer neste aspecto. E para terminar, o arranha-céus, o edifício Francageni, muito perto do município de Nova Iorque. Estive na altura em que trabalhava em Nova Iorque a visitar e tinha tido a possibilidade de trabalhar com Gary, na Califórnia, numa ampliação de uma escola famosa, uma escola de design. Depois não se teve nada, porque aconteceu o setembro. Mas acho que setembro aquilo é feito por sponsor. Fiz não sei quantos jantares com senhoras viúvas, claramente, tirando dinheiro, uma série de jantares, era o sponsor. E aquilo ia muito bem encaminhado. Ele fazia a biblioteca e eu fazia um workshop, um sítio de trabalho e armazéns e tal. Eu fazia a biblioteca. Fizemos o projeto e tive a ocasião de ver como ele trabalhava no escritório. Eu não trabalhei sempre assim, também seria um pouco de show, mas pareceu-me, ao contrário, muito autêntico. Havia uma grande maquete de colaboradores. Eu pegava em bocados de frigotério, vasos frigotério, atirava por cima da coisa e via efeitos que aquilo dava. E aquilo, para mim, era de tomar a sério, tomei muito a sério, porque era promover o balanço, o que é instinto e acaso e o que é raciocínio. E, portanto, reforçar essa hipótese de liberdade instintiva, aceitação do acaso mesmo e racionalidade. E este edifício tem isso, uma vez de edifício, mas só. A primeira coisa que impressiona, pelo a mim, quando me aproximei, disse: estou em Nova Iorque. Porque este edifício, da minha maneira de ver, reflete o que é Nova Iorque completamente. Tem uma série de torções no desenvolvimento do aço, mas tem uma presença nada gratuita, ou móvel, tal é uma estrutura sólida, é Nova Iorque. Mas tem uma coisa especial, muito me impressionou. Há mais outras coisas? Não há. Oh, claramente não falhou essa. Mas eu descrevo. É que tenho certeza que não há outra. Né? Bom, mas eu descrevo. É que há uma rua que vai junto a este edifício, junto a este edifício, uma rua estreita. Aliás, vê-se por aqui que há de ser. Há muita construção em tijolo. O Haia, onde eu construí o Hell's Kitchen, muita construção em tijolo. Da altura, de pequena altura, não sei assim, 4 pisos, 5 pisos. Bom, ele pousa esta torre metálica num vazamento, como é que se diz? Pódio, exatamente. Ela é fantástica. O pódio. O pódio é a coisa mais ingrata que há e dá muitos maus exemplos ao construir edifícios em altura de torres. Porque fica aquilo pulsado ali com regulação. É péssimo. Mas neste caso, o que é que faz o Gary? Pousa realmente uma base em tijolo mais larga. Não é este que está no primeiro plano, é um que está, é por isso que tem pena não haver outra fotografia. Mas quem vai pela rua, esse pódio é na mesma em tijolo, como o resto da rua. E é ligeiramente mais largo, um bocado mais largo que a torre, mas quem percorre aquela rua estreita olha para o arranha-céus e parece do outro lado da rua. Quer dizer, não há. Ele tirou completamente o ar da torre que pousa numa base. É uma coisa que está do outro lado da rua e que se mistura com outras torres que há na fotografia. Não abrange tudo. E, portanto, uma coisa em que eu penso parece há muito tempo. O Gary, e sobretudo a divulgação da obra do Gary nas revistas, vai procurar de forma obsessiva o extraordinário, o completamente diferente. A autonomia total. E, no fundo, o que eu vi em algumas obras, eu acho que não se pode dizer isso a ele, nem a mim, também não gosto nada do termo, como textualista. Não lhe é alheio realmente o sítio onde constrói e o que o rodeia, além de outras memórias distantes. E aqui acontece isso, como acontece noutra dimensão e força comunicativa no Museu de Bilbao. Porque o Museu de Bilbao tem aquelas formas pujantes e tal. E os fotógrafos isolam essas formas. Mas quem está lá, e eu pude estar porque construí um edifício muito perto dele. E o que é que se nota? Eu conhecia aquela zona de Bilbao antes da intervenção do Nogueira. Era o antigo Porto. Foi abandonado. Era um buraco escuro, horrível, com um viaduto horrível, monstruoso e tal. Ele não demoliu, conseguiu. E ele pega naquilo tudo e constrói o ponto mais prestigiado da cidade, apreciado, e não podia ser, aquele edifício, a ideia que me dá é que não podia ser de outra maneira. E pronto, está ali, é grande. Contexto ali. Não lhe digas nada, senão... Bem, pronto, já fui muito longo. Agradeço a vossa paciência.
Oh, thank you so much, Alvaro Siza, for this memory shared and this. I think it's time to open the debate, and I'm sure that we have been inspired with this kind of trip conducted by Alvaro Siza. I don't see hands, not yet. Is anyone wishing to start?
Could I just can I just make a couple of corrections? One of them, the transcription was inaccurate. It should not be Giddens, Anthony Giddens, but it should be Gideon, of course. Siza was talking about the architectural historians Bruno Sevi and Siegfried Gideon. And the other colleague he was talking about in the case of Berlin was Hart Walter Hämer, H-A-2-dots-M-E-R, not Hammer. So apologies for the misspellings on those, just corrections.
And I believe there's some more details. I think we should go over and to correct these little things. So, dear friends, no reactions. Louise, what about Barragán?
Well, the thing is, if you're calling upon me, is that the presentation by Siza is so powerful that we're speechless. That's the truth. We're still absorbing all the things he said and the way he said them, and I have no questions. I'm still enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for bringing it.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. We were really lucky to be able to have him with such a kind of a spirit. I always say that in this day, Siza, you know, he forget the body and he fly with the spirit. It was really amazing.
And Fernando Diaz raises the hand, and then Shantel after him.
I also raised a hand.
Oh, Fernando, please.
And
Yes.
Yes, it's nice to see how he enjoys such a wide variety of expressions and sensibilities, and all those different architects seems to nourish him in the sense that he's conveying the idea that architecture is a very wide, how do you say, a very wide panorama, and none of this speaks of exclusion. This sensibility is including the richness of the world, of diversity of the world of architecture, and I think this is reconforting point of view for all of us. Thank you.
So I can't see the hands. It's very strange.
It's Sengo and Shantel both raised hands.
I was very struck by his comment that there's one thing without which architecture would be the most boring thing in the world: enthusiasm. And it struck me that perhaps one of the services of criticism is to sort of help us to find or discover enthusiasm where we might not immediately feel it. Because we listen to a talk like this and we see a sort of the wonder and enchantment. So he's showing us these things that enchanted him. But that comment about enthusiasm reminded me of that the process of just looking at things, and not everything does elicit that enthusiasm, and some things that don't immediately elicit enthusiasm might eventually do so as we look at them more closely. So it seems to me that that's something that it seems like that's an important role that criticism plays.
Thank you, Shantel.
Thank you, Shantel. Sengo, yes. Oh, Ruth, do you? Yes.
Sorry. You go.
Sengul, you are mute.
Okay, thank you for letting me speak. Actually, I am going to ask all of you something. Was in the Lisbon Fair, he designed the most beautiful building. Do I remember correctly?
Yes, you are talking about the pavilion of Portugal, the one that has the baldacchino.
Yes, yes, that's very impressive. But after having so much experience in studying or joining to Zaha, I'm surprised that he built Bonjour Tristesse in Berlin. One of my colleagues took me to see it, and it was 2008. He told me that the municipality was thinking about turning it down for several reasons. The way he managed the corner is beautiful. It's really striking, but the fenestration is so repetitive and so small windows, even smaller than the Renaissance. So in that sense, I think his experience from Zaha does not reflect in the solution, because if he did, he could run a very short participational approach research before designing the building. I know who or whom it is designed, and it's very different from the cultural experiences of these minorities. We in Turkey, our history is filled with very bright, very nice windows, sceneries, and light. It is important in our culture. And also, houses are differentiated on a scale over integratedness and segregatedness. Turkish families used to share integrated house types, integrating also house types. And the house types I studied in Bonjour Tristesse are terribly segregating, and the designs, I'm sorry to say that, but designs are peculiar, not very nice. I don't know how he would defend himself here, or would he, because he is a great architect, but the title is well chosen for the German community. The title is well chosen. It is Bonjour Tristesse, as if we are rebuilding the massive houses of the rightists of the 1940s and 50s. They are no more in these days. That's for one thing. And the other thing is, more interested architects develop better solutions, like Rob Grier in Vienna, for example. Very beautiful houses for the Turkish population with great inner sofas, outer sofas. It was great. I was surprised. He studied the culture. I think he would have taken the same route. Thank you.
Thank you, Sengul. I would like just to add that the Bonjour Tristesse, as we know, it's a François Sagan romance, and it's in a way a nostalgic reference, I think, to this image. But I would like to recall that the building is not just housing, it has social facilities which are a great success, a kindergarten.
No.
A geriatric center.
Soon after it was built, these small shops were torn down.
Sorry,
Abandoned.
what I'm saying,
That is why
is
the
that
discussion had started of demolishing it.
okay, but what I'm saying is that the social facilities, the kindergarten and the center for geriatric, it's a great success. I had the opportunity to visit it, and it's really fantastic how it works. I don't know if anyone wants to profit for. We are really in time. I don't know, Ruth.
Wilfried.
Wilfried.
Wilfried, okay. And then perhaps we close, and we are going to have the chance to listen to Pierre-Alain Croset, who's going to talk about Malagueira, and I hope that in the final debate we can return to this. Wilfried, please.
Well, I'm sure we'll talk about Siza, but let me say a couple of things. First of all, I think the lecture that Alvaro Siza offered was a very generous way of saying, I'm not going to talk about my work as an example of how one can achieve a synthesis between autonomy and engagement. I'm going to talk about other examples that have inspired me, particularly at the end, Frank Gehry. And so it's an absolutely intelligent way of criticizing the title of the conference in a constructive way by giving other examples. So that's the first point. The second point, to answer Şengül, maybe you have looked at the history of the project. Originally, there were various versions for the housing schemes, and the apartments were not as small as they were finally built. The floor-to-ceiling levels were much more generous. Siza had to adopt different standards that were forced upon him by the developer. The shops that used to be there, the single-story pre-war buildings, he wanted to preserve and to build on top of that. The engineers forbade him to do that. So there are a number of decisions that were taken outside his realm of decision-making, and there were a number of compromises. Now, I don't believe that when one designs housing, one designs for a particular set of users. And as it happens, of course, there has been a change in the type of occupants also over the years. That's not to say that you know, people with a particular lifestyle don't have a right to you know, live in a certain way. But I don't think it's correct to say that one should design specifically for a Turkish community. I'm sorry. I think one has to be more inclusive. So that's you know, that's just to say things are not as simple as finally they appear. And I think one has to understand that reality intervenes maybe sometimes when you don't feel that you should actually claim the authorship. But I think Siza took on the responsibility, and as Anna has said, the project offers more than just this piece of housing. It's a remarkable piece of urban renewal that includes the redesign of public spaces inside the courtyard. And it is one of the few examples where urban renewal, with all your observations on the minimal and rather mean standards of windows and apartment sizes notwithstanding, it is one of the most remarkable pieces of the IBA project as a whole. I don't think you find anything as successful as an overall strategy as this particular project.
Thank you, Wilfried. I'm afraid we must now go to a little interval till 10:30. Am I right, Ruth?
Yes, 10 minutes interval, and we are coming back.
Yes.
I'll give the floor to Anna.
Isabel, NOBRE.
Ana Luisa Nobre that will share the second part of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming and your.
So now we give the floor to our colleague Ana Luisa Nobre for sharing the second part of this conference. Thank you, Ana Luisa, for accepting the task. Thank you very much.
It's a mission. So good morning or good afternoon or good night, everyone. We will start now the third session of the papers of this conference, the architecture between autonomy and engagement, which was organized by my Brazilian colleagues, Carlos Eduardo Comas and Ruth Design, who, as everybody knows, are among the most distinguished architectural critics in Latin America and the Portuguese-speaking world. So I'm very grateful for their invitation. And I must also congratulate everyone who is part of the team who has been responsible for the tremendous effort that is organizing this event. And first of all, I would like to dedicate this session to architect, critic, historian, curator, and professor Joseph Hickford, who has been such a leading force at the Committee of Architectural Critics for the last decades, and will always be an inspiration for all of us. So I was lucky enough to meet him a couple of times, and I cannot start the session today without remembering. I must say also I'm very honored to be a member of the International Committee of Architectural Critics since the 1990s. And I have been lucky to take part in some beautiful meetings over time. But I come to this meeting with a new feeling, as I have been asking myself in the last years about the potential of architectural criticism to actively contribute to raise the quality of life in the planets we share with a multiplicity of beings, entities, and life forms, and involving complex weavings of minerals, energy, materials, human activity, and so forth. So as a Brazilian female critic, researcher, professor, I'm pretty much convinced that our greatest challenge today is about raising awareness of architecture's impact on the planet and discussing possibilities and alternatives of designing and living otherwise. That is to say, countering colonialism, extractivism, racism, patriarchalism, anthropocentrism, with what Colombian author Arturo Escobar calls a pluriversal imagination. So it's my deep hope that this session somehow will bring a contribution, even if very small, to an urgent ontological turn in architecture. It's a move which may also be inspired by Denise Scott Brown's final words in the video which opened the conference last week, and I quote, it's about trying to understand the patterns we find ourselves in and react to them, opening the window of architecture wider and looking onto a broader world than the one we have been trained in. So this is a very strong call, I think, coming from a very strong woman. So today we'll have 3 presentations, 3 multi-dwelling housing projects, all of them in Europe, dating from the 1960s and 70s, in different contexts and political climates, with different design strategies, different scales and objectives, signed, all 3 of them by exceptional architects, legendary architects, all male architects, white male architects, actually. So though all 3 projects may be well known to all of us, we are all looking forward to the presentations as they bring new perspectives to the debates on autonomy and engagement, which is the subject of this conference. So each presentation will last 20 minutes, and after all presentations, we'll have a time to the debate. Everyone is invited to participate, and it can also be via chat. We will open up with Pierre-Alain Croset with analysis of the Quinta Malagueira housing from Alvaro Siza in Evora. Then we'll have Martin Haettasch, and he will show us Neue Stadt from German architects Oswald Matthias Ungers in Cologne, Germany. And then Shantel Blakely, which will bring us the key to the apartment building on Via Solaroli in Milan from Italian architect Marco Zanuzo. So I will introduce our first speaker, which is Pierre-Alain Croset. He's an architect, critic, and professor at Politecnico di Milano in Italy. He has also taught in Switzerland, Austria, United States, and China. From 1982 to 1996, he was assistant editor of Casabella under the direction of Vittorio Gregotti. Having published also many critical works on modern and contemporary architecture. From 1985 to 1993, he was also a collaborator of Luigi Snozzi, first at Lausanne and later in his office of Locarno, working from 1995 as a professional architect in Brescia. He has also been the curator of exhibitions and monographs on Cesare Cattaneo, Gino Valle, Luigi Snozzi, Alvaro Siza, and Juan Navarro Baldeweg. So Pierre-Alain Croset will take us to Alvaro Siza's Quinta da Malagueira, and I'll pass over to you, Pierre-Alain. You may share your PowerPoints. You have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana-Luisa, for the presentation. Quinta da Malagueira in Evora is perhaps the most studied, most visited, and most cited social housing estate in the architectural debate in the last 40 years. In 1977, Siza began a design and construction process that would prove to be extremely long, complex, and laborious. Although the estate still appears incomplete in a large part of its public infrastructure, in 2016 it was included, along with 17 other Portuguese works by Alvaro Siza, in the tentative list of Portugal for UNESCO World Heritage List, while in 2027, on the occasion of the celebrations and activities planned for the recognition of Evora as European Capital of Culture, it was announced that the grandiose semi-dome, conceived by Siza since the first sketches as a symbolic center of the new city, would finally be realized 50 years after the start of the design process. In this contemporary debate on autonomy and engagement, the subject of this conference, Quinta da Malagueira represents a particularly interesting case study. What is conceived and realized by Siza cannot be interpreted as a traditional architectural work limited to a single building, because it concerns an entire territory and the relationships between architecture, urban design, infrastructure, and landscape. Malagueira also marks a significant transitional moment in Siza's career in a political season of strong and rapid changes after the revolution of 25th of April, 1974. It was Siza's first opportunity to intervene on a scale. It is particularly interesting to analyze how urban planning and architectural design are inextricably linked in the complex process of conception. Thanks to the extraordinary richness of the archival sketches and drawings now preserved and enhanced by the organization Drawing Matter, it's possible to access online to the digitized documents to reconstruct Siza's thinking and his very particular way of designing. The story of the beginning of the design of the Malagueira is well known. Since the publication in 1979 in the pages of the Portuguese magazine Arquitectura, of the text in which Siza explained how it had started from the idea noticed on the first visit, because he believed that the idea is in the place more than in one's head for those who know how to see. And for this reason, it can and must emerge at first glance. Other points of view, his and others, will overlap. And so what was born simple and linear will become complex and closer to reality, really simple. This photograph is representing Siza walking through the abandoned countryside of the Quinta da Malagueira on the first day of his inspection at the 18th of March, 1977. With his gaze turned towards the photographer, Siza holds his sketchbook in his hands and observes the Malagueira terrain. This notebook, now in the drawing matter collection, was acquired in Evora by Siza, who explained why, for the first time, he had felt the need to use this medium, beginning a systematic practice of sketching and noting that he would not abandon since. I quote, "I had to take notes because of the complexity of the project. I bought this Red School exercise book, filling its 70 pages in the first 3 days of the visit. I continued working on the project for over 20 years." From March 1977 to March 1999, the memory of this very long design process is preserved in no less than 52 notebooks that can be studied directly online. Observing today, almost 50 years later, the 56 pages of Cardano 1 dedicated to Malagueira, at the same time as observing the realized neighborhood, reveals how strong and almost immediate Siza's design intuition was during the 3 days of intense exploration of the area. First on foot, and afterwards in the view from above in a small plane. Siza's sketches clearly show how precisely all the fundamental architectural principles that will permanently structure the changing territory of Malagueira had already been identified. The typology of patio houses organized in regular blocks, the idea of the aqueduct that contains the infrastructure networks and crosses the state, the relationship of continuity with the pre-existing clandestine neighborhoods, the adaptation of the architecture to the slope lines, and the strategic insertion of public buildings in their articulations between the various parts of the new fabric. In visiting Quinta da Malagueira today, we can verify not only how these few fundamental architectural principles have indeed managed to endure in the long term, but also and above all, how Siza's singular design approach, testified to in his sketches, has acted concretely on the physical side. Siza's attitude toward the context, characterized by extreme sensitivity, empathy, and attention to all the natural and artificial presences on the site, conditions the way we perceive the architecture of the Malagueira. The most beautiful experience when visiting, not perceptible from photographs alone, is to concretely discover how Siza's architecture is not only present in its dimension as an object, but also and above all, in its acting as a kind of filter or litmus test, revealing to us all these elements that Siza had observed and identified during his first inspection. It's nice, for example, to discover how effectively the streets with the rows of houses follow the lines of maximum slope and make the topography readable, but also naturally channel rainwater down to the park and central pond. It deserves special attention to observe how Siza treated the meditating spaces between the new fabric and the existing Santa Marta district with great care, particularly along Rua dos Dois Bairros, with a sequence of small squares. We also discover how the new architecture causes framing effects in the views, highlighting these elements that Siza had represented in the sketches: cork oaks and small rocks, a cistern, the 2 old mills, but also the silhouette of the walled city of Evora in the distance, clearly visible above the horizontal line of the new aqueducts. I've also been able to verify how seemingly minor elements such as garages play a fundamental role in defining urban spaces. Requested by residents but built late, when the principle of parking cars along residential streets originally planned as pedestrian streets had become established, garages emerged in the open landscape as large blind enclosures, reminiscent of the high walls of large rural estates, rotated with respect to the grid of new houses. These large enclosures actually used more as cellars and activity rooms than as garages, build horizontal lines in the landscape, forming a kind of domestic counterpoint to the monumental presence of the aqueducts, contributing decisively to the creation of a series of transitional spaces, often triangular, between residential blocks and the central park. If today, when visiting Quinta da Malagueira, the perception of a rare quality of quiet, of balance, of harmony between architecture and nature, and between new and existing, seems to prevail, this feeling appears in stark contrast to the first published photographs, almost always in black and white, as for example, this famous picture made in 1982 by Roberto Colova, which shows in all its harshness the construction site of the new architecture, white and sharp, but still lacking the new inhabitants, with unfinished streets and no paving. In one of the first publications, the pages of Casabella in 1982, Jean-Paul Rayon got on a small plane to photograph the construction site from above, pointing out, I quote him, fundamental acts of settlement, street grids and the institutions of the structural access as a true foundation ritual. This interpretation was taken up and further developed by Francesco Venezia and later by Pierluigi Nicolin, who spoke of a sense of dizziness in realizing that, I quote, the image of the building site can be converted into that of an archaeological excavation. I vividly remember being personally fascinated in those years by this image of Malagueira as a process and not as a work. While still a student in my graduating year at EPFL, I had been invited by Vittorio Grigotti to join the editorial staff of Casabella and to design the first issue with him, the issue number 478 of March 1982. In the autumn of 1981, Siza was a visiting professor at EPFL in Lausanne, with Jean-Paul Rayon as his assistant, and was thus a direct witness of the way in which the Malagueira publication, strongly desired by Grigotti, was designed. What was fascinating at the time in these photographs was the almost brutal contrast between the strong formal identity of the new architecture and the apparent fragility of the landscape, with the signs of its rural past. In the context of the architectural debate of the early 1980s, perhaps overstretched in the oppositions between postmoderns, neo-moderns, and late moderns, Quinta da Malagueira seemed to announce that the radical utopia of the modern movement was not entirely exhausted, and Siza's architecture demonstrated that it was possible to be both radically modern and contextualist. To describe the slow, laborious, and long-lasting process of transformation of the Malagueira territory, Siza used the powerful metaphor of a heavy white sheet delicately laid on the undulating surface of the land. After a few years, he observed how this white sheet, I quote, begins to reveal the hidden accidents. Over the whole extent of the ground, the pattern slips, approaches, absorbs, multiplies, reproduces, deforms. It becomes transparent again. It announces the end of my designing the Malagueira. Written in 1984, at the time of strong attacks on the project, when only a little more than half of the new estate has been realized, this sentence highlights how Siza was already at that time addressing the problem of the architect's role as author, who must at some point disappear. Later, when the neighborhood was almost finished, Siza was invited to comment on a sentence by Rafael Moneo, who stated that in Evora, Siza would have his figure as an architect disappear. Siza replied that not only did he love this phrase from Moneo, but that he was also convinced that he had, I quote, "the obsession of one day achieving this naturalness. It's certain that much of this is the product of time, which acts as a great architect." In deciding that the railings should all be single-family patio houses, Siza had set the compositional principles of only two types of floor plans with extreme rigor, which had to offer the possibility of growing over time from 2 to 5 rooms. And now the question is, how did this principle of typological rigorism and linguistic repetition effectively allow for the control and governance of the inevitable process of transformation following residence occupancy? This question has fueled 2 lines of academic research in recent years, seemingly antagonistic but complementary. On the one hand, studies of formal analysis and design methodology, and on the other hand, anthropological and sociological studies on the post-occupancy of houses. Among the studies of the first group, the most interesting and innovative one was elaborated in 2001 by Jose Pinto Duarte as a doctoral thesis in the context of the Design and Computation PhD program at MIT, under the direction of William Mitchell, who had pioneered the use of computers for the parameterization of geometric rules in architecture. Duarte used the same methodology to elaborate a geometric analysis of the 35 variants of the 2 basic plans drawn up by Siza, and then parameterized these variants in a set of geometric rules that he entitled the Malagueira shape grammar. He proposed later to use this shape grammar for generating new, completely unprecedented variants directly involving this experimentation Siza, who validated the design as stylistically coherent with his own architecture. Duarte's research is therefore interesting in proposing a singular decontextualization of Malagueira's architecture, which in undergoing a process of abstraction and parameterization becomes an autonomous language that goes beyond the traditional relationship between author and work. In reality, Duarte's research went beyond a simple interest in parametric digital design methods. In proposing customizing mass housing at the title of his thesis, Duarte identified the possibility of adapting the production of social housing to the ever-changing demands of the inhabitants, while maintaining an overall coherence of architectural language. The interest then intersected with the second line of research, which, instead of starting from Siza's design work, is based on the analysis of the inhabitants' lifestyles and the effects of the transformation of architecture. The most in-depth and interesting work was elaborated in 2013 by Mario Gomez in the context of the doctorate in anthropology at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa. This research is based on the in-depth visit of 100 houses with the interview of the owners or tenants to measure the degree of satisfaction and the reasons for the transformations carried out. The photographic documentation shows how the interiors of the houses, full of signs of appropriation in the furniture and decoration, express neo-vernacular and traditionalist tastes far removed from the sharpness and simplicity of Siza's perspective sketches. From a sociological and anthropological point of view, however, it's precisely this distance between real domestic space and the architect's ideal vision that accounts for architectural success. However, we cannot ignore some significant changes in the socioeconomic composition of the neighborhood population, which is now much more mixed and varied than its original conditions, contributing to a partial gentrification process of the neighborhood. In walking the streets of Malagueira, one indeed discovers an exceptional quality of architectural integrity, which the resident signs of appropriation have not diminished, remaining inconspicuous. Interior transformations remain hidden behind the high walls of the patios, or external transformations are limited to the design of painted frames around the openings, a memory of vernacular and terror architecture, and rare cases of kitsch additions with stone or wrought iron inserts. We are therefore struck by the positive impression of a good state of conservation and respect for the exterior facades, enriched with the growth of trees and flowers within the patios, but also by the quality of the street space with this simple granite block paving, an image of care and dignity far removed from the degradation and desolation of many social housing neighborhoods built in the same years in Europe. What we visit today is therefore very different from the black and white images that portrayed in the first publications a city in foundation, certainly still very uncomfortable for the first inhabitants, with some houses without water and electricity due to the slowness with which the infrastructure was built. Privileged witnesses of this slow and arduous process of transformation of Malagueira from a construction site to a real city were a number of architects, photographers, and critics, including Roberto Colova, who began photographing in 1982 before returning many times from 1985 to 2020. And Brigitte Fleck, who remembers a first trip with only a few foundations and a few walls, explaining, I quote, that everything was charming and a reason to come back again, year after year, to be able to see at the end of all these years that Malagueira is, without a doubt, Alvaro Siza's most intimate, most painful, and therefore most important project. Although still lacking in many of the public buildings, shops, and offices that had been planned up to the stage of working drawings by Siza, Quinta da Malagueira has recently seen a growing demand for progressive patrimonialization, which is particularly evident in its inclusion in 2016 in the tentative list of Portugal for the UNESCO World Heritage List, and in the initiation in 2022 of the procedure for recognition as a national monument by the General Directorate of Cultural Heritage of Portugal. These initiatives have contributed to a decisive intensification of university research in the recent years, not only enriching the cognitive framework, but also contributing decisively to the public debate on the preservation and future completion of Malagueira. These studies also highlight certain risks typical of any patrimonialization action of causing negative effects on the resident population, intensifying the gentrification phenomena. Evora will also become a European Capital of Culture in 2027. While many activities and cultural events will take place in the old city, Malagueira will be the focus of the project Under Malagueira's Sky, 50 years of habitat and community, created by Nuno Grande, which intends to involve the active participation of the inhabitants. This project should culminate with the inauguration of the grandiose semi-dome open to the landscape, which Siza had conceived as a symbolic center of the new city. One of the first sketches from March 1977 portrays Siza, seen from behind with his notebook in his left hand, observing the landscape with the Quinta da Malagueira enclosure and the Acropolis of the historic city in the background, while in the foreground, a cork tree and a small cistern appear on the right. Siza described precisely the moment when he discovered these two small elements during his first visit, being impressed by the way they dominated the landscape, arousing the feeling of being in a strategic point. Subsequently, he imagined the large semi-dome as a symbol to build the center of the new city, and it's no coincidence that in his sketches we see that under the vault remained these two small elements, the cistern and the tree, water and nature. Siza continues his story by explaining that unfortunately with the construction site, these small fragile elements were destroyed, recalling that he was in despair about this cruelty. But his conclusion is optimistic. If that dome is really built, I will most probably build another cistern and plant another tree. We must hope that the semi-dome will finally be realized, not only as a beautiful public building long awaited by the inhabitants of Malagueira, but also to keep alive the memory of the extraordinary originality of Siza's thought and design method, which demonstrated that the idea of a new city was in the place more than in one's head, and therefore emerged at his first glance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Alain, for keeping the time as well. It's quite a challenge to present such a complex project in such a short time. So thank you very much. And we'll have time to talk in the end, but if there are any immediate questions or immediate comments, please let us know, raise your hands.
Yes, please.
Otherwise, we'll go on to the second speaker. Okay. Okay, can we go on? Okay.
Should I share my screen?
Yes. Yes, Martin, while you do so, I will introduce you very briefly also. Martin Haettasch, and I hope I say it right.
Yes.
He's a German architect whose work focuses on the intersection of architecture and urbanism. He holds degrees from the Technical University of Braunschweig and the Princeton University. He has also worked in the US and Europe, including Atelier Kemper-Thiel and WW Architecture. He's currently an assistant professor at the University of Texas in Austin, in the United States, and his work has been published in numerous venues, including the Plan Journal, Architect Magazine, and Thresholds. He's also editor of Radical Middle Grounds, New Agendas for Medium Density Housing, published by the Center of American Architecture and Design at the University of Texas. And he is the happy recipient of the Architect Magazine Studio Prize in 2018 and the ACSA AIA Housing Design Education Awards in 2022. So Martin will show us the Neue Stadt by German architects Oswald Matthias Ungers in Cologne, Germany. And so Martin, it's with you. You have 20 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Ana-Luisa, for your introduction, and also a quick shout out and thank you to everyone who has put together this fantastic conference, the moderators, Wilfried Wang in particular for very valuable intellectual feedback on my work, and of course all the other presenters. German architect Oswald Matthias Ungers' work provides an instructive precedent for a practice that is characterized by what Dutch scholar Lara Schreiber calls contingent autonomy. As Schreiber observes, Ungers' desire to establish architecture outside of, quote, external constraints of architecture being made into its theme and content, unquote, by no means precludes the possibility of architecture to have social impact, although not as a simple equation of cause and effect. While it is Ungers' experimental work of the 1970s that is most readily construed as the discursive nexus between the social optimism of the 1960s and the retreat into a self-contained discourse on disciplinary mechanisms, his attempts to define a sort of in-between position go further back. Ungers' project for a Neue Stadt, a new city, in Cologne, documents this search for an autonomous formal language of mass housing at the same time as it marks a shift from looking at the city as an autonomous formal system in itself to architecture as a discernible counterpoint to the systemic nature of the city. Part 1. Part of the West German post-war housing boom, the project for a new city on the northern edge of Cologne was announced in 1958, with the underlying ideas going back to earlier studies by Fritz Schumacher and Rudolf Schwarz. Based on the city's master plan, Ungers submitted his entry for the Seeberg segment in the spring of 1962. Familiar with the realities of housing construction in post-war Germany, Ungers' entry for the first time attempts to formulate a coherent theoretical basis for housing as an urban project. It embodies the search for architectural quality in response to a predominantly quantitative definition of housing in a welfare state marked by rapid growth, expanding infrastructure, and car-based mobility. A few years later, would Ungers state the underlying problem on the opening pages of the 5th issue of his pamphlet series at the Technical University of Berlin, titled Großformen im Wohnungsbau, Large Form in Housing. If the housing units built between 1950 and 1965 were given architectural form, this is the diagram on the far right, they would cover 500 kilometers of highway between Hamburg and Frankfurt, with a building 100 stories tall. Facing these unprecedented scales of housing production, the central question for Ungers is how an increase of quantity can be transformed into a new architectural quality. I haven't actually found out whether Ungers actually read Marx on this. Ungers's ideas about what this architectural quality might entail are rooted in a forceful rejection of functionalism. Decoupling architectural principles, Gesetzlichkeit, from an intended functional purpose, Zweckgesinnung, he introduces the ambition of Neue Stadt as no less than a complete rewriting of urban morphology. The project codifies the social content of housing into a universal rule set of autonomous architectural forms that could live up to the challenge of quantity by scaling up. Starting from the room, the project devises a spatial duality of solids and void, which, maybe somewhat ironically, designate a functional division into serving and served spaces. This relationship becomes formal device, functional arrangement, and social paradigm. The idea of the dwelling emerges as a diagram of collectivity. Spaces of retreat are grouped around a collective center. Stacked vertically, these volumes form extruded towers that become the constituent elements of the larger aggregate cluster, thus short-circuiting the architectural and urban scales. A key thesis underlying the project is the seamless continuity between the fundamental formative logic of architecture and the city, which is repeated across the site to form various figures. Ungers's insistence on architecture's spatial agency and the belief that the challenges of urbanization can be managed with architectural tools locate his ideas close to those of his contemporaries of Team 10. Neue Stadt takes up the concept of the habitat, in particular as formulated by Werner Ebli, Reinhard Gieselmann, and Theo Muntz from the Swiss delegation at SIAM's 9th Congress in Aix-en-Provence in 1953, which Ungers had attended. Providing partial answers to Ungers's quality-quantity dilemma, they reject the idea of mass housing in favor of a methodical progress from individual cell to family cluster, quarter, neighborhood, and city in search for collective elements across scales. The Neue Stadt competition would ultimately not take the final step that led many of Ungers's Team 10 peers to define habitat as an expansive mat structure that irrevocably reverses the figure-ground relationship of the modernist object in space. Ungers instead remains committed to an additive aggregation of discernible objects. The autonomous formal language itself becomes systemic in nature, a single paradigm maintaining the dual modernist prospect of design control and universal validity. While born out of a rejection of functionalism as a singular principle for urban design, Neue Stadt ultimately replaces it with an equally exclusive systemic formal paradigm. Part 2. A project greatly reduced in scope was eventually built on a portion of the site. Where the original competition had been a series of bottom-up aggregations, the build scheme more decisively embraces the character of a single architectural object. Occupying half of a large block, the building forms a linear spine along a walkway that allows pedestrian movement along its entire length. The simplification of the primary geometry is supported by a change in the cluster organization. The original aggregation of rooms and apartments is replaced by a cruciform layout, introducing a middle scale containing shared vertical circulation and service cores for 3 apartments per floor. The cruciform clusters are then aligned to form a spine, the width of a single room, which is 4 meters and 55, at its narrowest. In this arrangement, the reading of collective scales of aggregation is replaced by a vaguely linear object into which cruciform solids are docked at specific intervals. The result is a precarious balance of the multiplicity of a polycentric organization contained within the unity of a singular formal gesture of the line. The build project points towards a dialectic understanding of form, one in which parts and whole are becoming increasingly equal players. The introduction of a cohesive top-down strategy against the bottom-up clustering is no accident. Among the materials documenting the development of Neue Stadt, a collage titled Primärarchitektur, Primary Architecture, stands out, depicting several large-scale linear structures, including the Göltzsch Viaduct in Germany and the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Ungers' increasing interest in the ability of an overarching formal gesture to contain smaller organizational units is reflected by the introduction of the linear walkway through the project and the alignment of the clusters along this spine. The direction of Neue Stadt after 1962 anticipates themes Ungers would further explore in Grossformen, where gross, by the way, refers less to an absolute size, but the inclusive quality associated with strong form. The formal coherence is achieved by what Ungers calls the existence of a figure or a theme, and becomes a quality through which gross form in his mind supersedes the sum of parts. In the case of Neue Stadt, this figure for Ungers is the binding element of the street. The street in Neue Stadt remains first and foremost a formal element, internal to the project rather than in the urban sense as a space of convergence of uses and constituencies. Rather than at the programmatic level, it operates as a device at the perceptual level. Ungers says, quote, concepts such as living wall, living carpet, living funnel, living hill, and living panel contain larger connections at the same time and characterize categories of a new approach to imagination in design. Thus, he appeals to the visual act of reading architecture and the observer's capability for conceptual synthesis. For Ungers, this cognitive processing allows for an intervention to become a charged presence that sets itself apart from both its functional content and its surroundings. More than a linear connection between 2 points, the pedestrian path is integrated into a system of passages and gateways that beyond its access function create a triple sense of self-awareness and multi-layered readings. First is the understanding of the project as a fortress-like object whose outer boundaries have to be consciously penetrated. The punched apertures in the smooth walls reinforce a threshold condition that sets apart the object from its surroundings. This abrasive sense of introversion is then offset as views and movement are directed through the project itself, creating fragmentary self-portraits and revealing its constituent parts. And finally, the device directs the view outward to frame episodic snapshots of the project's utterly banal suburban context. Although Ungers had accounted for the possibility of shared program to be inserted here, the publicness of the ground floor is predominantly spatial and visual. Ungers makes no effort to act upon the suburban environment, but merely establishes a critical distance, commenting rather than acting. Yet the passage along heavy steel doors, prosaically labeled Trockenraum, drying room, or Waschküche, laundry room, is flooded with light thanks to the narrowness of the plan, infusing the unapologetic display of the realities of the everyday collective activities with the airiness of strolling through an arcade. Unlike the competition design, the build project comes to terms with the physical and conceptual limits imposed by its surroundings. It is a fragment of an ideal city as much as it is a whole in a less than ideal city. The project engages in a cat and mouse game with the very premise of the urban block. The primary massing can be understood as half of a traditional perimeter block, creating an exterior facing the street and a semi-public interior. This classic pattern, however, is then challenged again by the outward extensions that subdivide the outer edge into 5 smaller street-facing courtyards. The geometry of these outer courtyards is simple, almost symmetrical, providing moments of explicit static space to counterbalance the dynamic reading of the overall massing and causing the project's legibility to oscillate between a continuous object in space and a sequence of framed urban spaces. While only partly built, plans for the further development of Neue Stadt after 1963 reveal Ungers' changing attitude towards the idea of growth. The site plan, at its largest extent, probably 1964, shows a series of independent yet interrelated enclaves, each organized around the linear element of the street. A U-shaped retirement home provides an end cap to the linear path. At a 90-degree angle, another segment consists of a series of low-rise courtyard houses, framing a pedestrian area, capped by, again, 3 additional apartment clusters. Although physically discontinuous and typologically different, the shared organization along a spine, the reprise of the cruciform clustering, and the internal solid and void logic of the courtyard houses identify the project as a conceptual whole. The discovery that disparate parts could maintain their individual character and be strung together into a conceptual totality of a gross form emerged in Ungers' work over a relatively short period of time. At the time of the development of Neue Stadt, Ungers was working on several projects that all explore the interplay between primary formal theme and the fragmentation of its constituent parts. Of particular interest is probably the unbuilt project for Cologne's Grünzug Süd, southern greenbelt on the far right, which in many ways picks up where Neue Stadt left off. More than Neue Stadt, Grünzug Süd maintains a simple linear organizing principle, referred to in this case as the wall by Ungers, that spans across several blocks and reinforces the edge between Cologne's southern suburb and a large park. Divided into 6 thematic segments, each block is then treated as a distinct enclave. Each segment interprets a morphological situation found in the surrounding context, and the wall becomes a catalyst through which contextual clues are assembled, reinforced, and ultimately shape a new context, in which the situation as found is, quote, not only preserved, but also to be interpreted and enhanced, unquote. Grünzug Süd would remain unique for several more years in its explicit reference to urban context and morphology, and fulfills a vision that Neue Stadt begins to explore but does not quite deliver on yet. An architectural object that is both autonomous and contextual, formally unified, yet accommodating of typological and potentially social differences within. Both projects are catalysts for the development of Ungers' ideas throughout the 1960s and 70s, and document the evolution of his attitude towards the relationship between architecture and urbanism, where the search for the architectural quality of mass housing initially led Ungers to scale up autonomous formal principles filtered through the idea of the habitat and intended as a universally applicable formula for the city as a work of art. Neue Stadt documents this shift from a late modernist to a postmodern sensibility. Frictions between the architectural and the urban project are not only accepted, but increasingly become the basis for a different interpretation of architectural autonomy. While Neue Stadt is inevitably flawed as a product of monofunctional mass housing in the 1960s, it already contains the ingredients to remedy its own situation. At the crossroads between system and object, it injects a dual dialectic into the seamlessness of the singular urban vision. The first plays out between the legible totality of the architectural gross form in the less defined field of urbanization, while the second emerges as the tension between its constituent parts. Not only would this dual dialectic become a recurring theme in Ungers' subsequent work, but it offers lessons for housing as an architectural project today. In an urban landscape no longer organized by traditional city, any meaningful intervention must be formally cohesive enough to provide a palpable spatial counterpoint to the informal networks of our daily existence and act as a marker of collective identity. On the other hand, it needs to be open-ended enough to accommodate the differences of a pluralistic society within its confines. As Ungers recognized, these qualities emerge not as much from the reinvention of the city, but from the specificity of the architectural project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much for your presentation. Ungers is such an inspiring architect, and still, I think he's also overlooked, at least in Latin America. We are very lucky, I think, to see it after Siza's Malagueiras. We are looking at two housing projects that are at least 60 years old, and yet they remain so challenging as they raise key questions to the concept of form, for instance. So I think we'll have a lot to discuss afterwards. But if anyone has any immediate questions or comments, please raise your hands. Otherwise, we'll move on. Okay. Okay, so Shantel, I can see you.
No, excuse me, if I can ask a question.
Okay.
I can.
Okay.
No, because I cannot find the tool for the hand, but I seen
Okay,
that
go ahead.
Sengulgur had the hand. It was probably before me, please.
Okay, Sengu. So we can hear you.
This reminds me of it, but he missed this time. I really enjoyed listening to both participants. As you already know, I'm interested in housing. They were wonderful, very well organized presentations. I have one question to Martin, and I like Ungers also very much. House without qualities. You remember that? He starts with that. That's wonderful. And fills it with all sorts of qualities. That's what I mean when I say flexibility, changeability, and accommodation. He's right. He accommodates, not causing many change. Actually, change in this case is rather difficult, I guess, because I have also studied star architecture research. I don't know how to read it, Herman Hertzberger. And I studied all his housings very closely. I have books about them. Not too many things change, you know. I think Ungers is more successful in providing opportunities because only at the entrance only 20 centimeters here and centimeters here. That is the basic difference I have observed here. Different family types can buy whatever is proper for them, or can make small changes as the life goes on. Thank you very much for reminding him to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just if I may, just a very small comment on this question of change, because what's interesting about the kind of first version of the project and then subsequent versions is that in the first version, he tries to build difference into the system. It doesn't look like that necessarily from the things, but the variety of apartment sizes and types that he tries to build into this cluster system is actually relatively large. In the second, that gets, I think some of it was simply cost cutting. It gets cut out, so the apartments get smaller in general.
It happens.
But then how he reacts to this is interesting in that he outsources the difference. He builds a series of courtyard houses next to it. And so I think that's an interesting change for me, where it's not covered by the overall system anymore, but he tries to put it next to each other as a separate fragment, which I think is one of those key components of a different sensibility towards what difference and what plurality in a city actually means.
But that requires also extra creativity, doesn't it? Do you like the result?
I was afraid somebody would ask that question. I do. I mean, I do, because it's difficult. It's a difficult whole. It's not a simple project. It's not a project that I would probably say should be, in the way that it sits right now, be what we base today's housing on. I think I like it as a discursive project, a project that's self-reflective, and a project that lays certain foundations for what I think we should be talking about. I grew to like the underspace. I came there not expecting much, and I think the total absence of narrative in that underspace, and of total programmatic narrative, is to me actually very interesting. That was probably the biggest surprise, like revisiting it after 10 plus years.
Good deduction. Thank you.
So I think we have Pierre and then Wilfried.
No, yeah,
Pierre-Alain?
yes, a short observation and a short question. My observation is that thank you for the presentation, because I didn't really study the first project of the competition. I find it extremely interesting and very, very contemporary in the idea of the cluster, because it is cluster of rooms and after cluster of buildings. And this is really interesting. And it's clear that it is very, very impressive the way in which Ungers is changing totally between the competition project and the realized one. My question is very simple. It is about the idea of gross form. Is it some kind of conceptual connections between Ungers and Hilbersheimer? It is a direct question, because I knew quite well Oswald Matthias Ungers, because we published a lot with Grigotti in the years in Casabella. But all this first part of his career and what he realized in 1960s, Ungers himself refused particularly to discuss about that. It was to say this is the past, so that this kind of question was not possible to be addressed directly to Ungers. So he refused to answer this kind of question. But it is a question, if you yourself in your studies on Ungers in the archives could find something related with Hilbersheimer.
So I have not studied that connection in the historical sense. I don't know if he looked at Hilbersheimer in that way. I do think Hilbersheimer's idea of the superblock, including sort of like the architecturalization, for lack of a better word, of a sort of like the gridded environment in Chicago or so, is interesting in that the goals are similar. I think Hilbersheimer's superblock tries to form a bigger bracket around a kind of urban unit of organization that also includes the idea of possible multiplicity. The superblock contain different types, different models for housing. And I think Ungers tries to do something similar with gross form. That's as much as I feel like I'm able to say with confidence.
Thank you.
Wilfried?
Well, I think we shall probably continue with this very important discussion afterwards, but I think I can't avoid to say that, sometimes both teachers as well as architectural critics and architects believe the words that they use more than the drawings or the buildings they create. So I think one of the things that we discussed, Martin and I, were, if you look at the plans or the model itself, is very telling. It's a kind of rhetorical device to clarify the diagram, and by insisting on the cells being enclosed in these black thick lines, the individual private cells, and then the kind of public space being this open space in between these cells, it underlines this idea that somehow there's a clarity of what is private and what is kind of semi-public as a wonderful idea that just goes on and on and on. So it is telling that the cross appears in this project, and that in the later stage of Ungers' life, he insists that the only thing one needs to do as an architect is this, and everything starts from the cross, creates a square, and all you need to do is a square, and then everything else will resolve itself. So this notion somehow, which I think is fundamentally Catholic, and reductive, and you know, this kind of somehow you find Elysium or heaven in this kind of a transcendental reduction, I think is just frightening, because life is so much more. And so Caesar's housing, which accepts the topography, and of course he's lucky to have topography, and Ungers has this flat piece of land, but it creates a much more human intervention on a repetitive scale, leaving the inhabitants to modify things. You know, talking about Schengel's point about flexibility and adaptability, you know, one of the central points, one of the central lessons to be learned from public housing of this scale as the Evora is that you know, after Pesach, what do you do? And if you say, you know, people are going to change their environment sooner or later, let's give them the opportunity. Let's, you know, what Aravena then, you know, sort of does in the sectional terms, but Caesar does in planimetric terms, is a much more human response to the question. And so Ungers just in the end is an absolute ideologue, and a kind of in my view, a kind of non-human, completely infatuated with the clarity of the diagram, and that makes me really very, very nervous.
I can see that. I mean, I can see that the nervousness in that, and I would agree that I think you could probably argue that Caesar's work is very much is actually much more engaged in the kind of everyday life. Ungers wants to make a theoretical statement with that project, right? Like, I mean, it's a piece of discourse for him. I don't think he cares much about necessarily the inhabitation of the project.
Well, I mean, that's telling, isn't it?
I think it is. I think in my mind, it doesn't make the project uninteresting. I think that the cruciform is also, I think there is a sweet spot in my mind in Ungers's work. I think he starts from the bottom up, aggregation, team 10, etc. Very late 60s sensibility. He goes into the 70s, and I think strong forms, cruciforms, squares coexist at a sort of even level with other things. And then he goes into the 80s, and the cruciform that takes over everything and becomes absolute again. So like I think to me in Ungers's work, I'm interested in that sweet spot that really allows for the sort of multiplicity of forms and doesn't use a singularity of kind of larger overarching gestures.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone. I think we must move on now. And I'm happy that we started the conversation. And Wilfred, while you were talking, I was thinking, well, but the Catholic here is Siza. So we'll probably have a lot to discuss. Also, very interested in the relationship with the ground that you brought about, between form and ground. It's also my particular interest. But
both are Catholic.
Both, okay. But one is a Portuguese Catholic and the other one is a German Catholic. That makes a big difference. Anyway, let's move on. I think we'll have time to discuss later on. And I'd like to welcome our last speaker, Shantel Blakely, who is an assistant professor at the Rice University School of Architecture in Houston, Texas, where she teaches architectural history and design studio. And her research and writing is concerned with architecture and architectural practice in the US and Europe from the 1995 to the present. She's currently writing a book called Apartamento Aperto on the Italian architect and industrial designer Marco Zanuzo. This will be published by MIT Press. And the second book project on the St. Louis African-American architect Charles E. Fleming has been supported by the Getty Research Institute and the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts. So between her studies at Princeton University and Columbia University, she worked at Thompson and Rose Architects and Mary Ann Thompson Architects in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Shantel will give us the key to the apartment building on Via Solaroli by Mark Zanuzo in Milan, Italy. So Shantel, you have 20 minutes and you may share your slides now. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. Thank you, Ruth and Wilfred. And thanks to Paolo Scrivano, who read a draft of my paper and gave some feedback. Okay, let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. In Milan, Italy, in the 1960s, the architect was considered by some observers to be a powerful figure. The philosopher Umberto Eco remarked in a 1970 newspaper article that in an encounter with an architect on the street, one felt that the architect's feet did not touch the ground, but hovered 5 centimeters above it. Such was the respect with which one was addressed. Eco called architects the last heroes of Milan. This characterization is consistent with the esteem in which Milan's architects had been held in Europe and the US since the end of World War II. My talk focuses on Marco Zanuzo, who was born in 1916, died in 2001, who was, according to one observer, a quintessential example of the Milanese architect in the mid-1950s. Before turning to his apartment complex on Via Solaroli and to how this project may bear on the theme of autonomy and engagement, it will be useful to characterize the context in which Zanuzo worked. Between 1945 and 1970, the period for which, for the purposes of this paper, I'm calling post-war, this cohort of architects was still energized by basic modernist approaches, including engaging with functionalism and the issue of workers' housing in the city. They were also inspired by more recent developments, such as the organicism of Frank Lloyd Wright, the softer geometries of Alvaro, and the audacity of Le Corbusier's proposals, such as the Unité d'Habitation. The building types of Lombardy and Northern Italy were of interest to them as well, but they recognized that the rapid conversion from mostly agricultural production in Italy to mostly industrial production would challenge existing architectural types, both through the social change it would entail and through the impacts of mass production. Marco Zanuzo was among a subgroup of these architects who took an interest in industrial design. It was not only the consumer product that interested this group, but a range of objects that were found in everyday spaces, including street lights, benches, street signs, and various kinds of graphic identity. Zanuzo, like most of these architects, had studied in the 1930s at the Milan Polytechnic, where hard sciences were part of the curriculum, including chemistry and geology, and where the ratio of architects to engineers hovered around 1 to 10. He was therefore at ease with technical subjects. In writings from the mid-1940s, he expressed enthusiasm for modularity, various light construction techniques and materials like aluminum, which he saw in terms of analogies between design and biology or chemistry. Zanuzo was not a prolific theory writer, however, more of a practical-minded professional. But in the 1950s and 60s, he was often quoted in newspapers or journals on the need for architects to immerse themselves in the production world. The admiration he expressed for noted architects such as Mies van der Rohe and Louis Kahn around 1960 highlighted their capacity to interpret the world of industry. And this hints at how he conceived the architect's role. Zanuzo's industrial design practice emerged from formative relationships he established early on with prominent industrial manufacturers. For some, he would design factories, for others, furniture and smaller objects. So on the right, the red chair there is the lady chair, which was first produced in 1947. And he also had a long-term relationship with Olivetti and designed 5 factories. This is the one that was constructed in Buenos Aires. And here's his office building on Via Senato in Milan with Roberto Menghi, which included interventions by Lucio Fontana, the artist. So these and other projects became part of a publicity spectacle that surrounded architecture in Milan in the 1950s. And it was partly through this high-profile architecture and design culture that the architect had emerged as the prominent figure that he was by 1970. But despite early post-war achievements, such as the QTH residential experimental quarter and dozens of buildings documented by architect Piero Bottoni in his 1954 anthology, and here I'm just showing a few images of the Triennale and the samples fair. Despite early successes, such as the QTA quarter or the many projects that Bottoni was able to document by 1954, architects in post-war Milan would fail to establish ties with government that would sustain the momentum. They soon relied on exceptional opportunities to get projects built. Nevertheless, through the visible association of architects with real estate and consumer products, architects came to be identified with the city's commercialization anyway. The book, Milano Oggi, it's a picture book devoted to Milan, written and edited by Joe Ponti, captures this duality quite well, in which architecture appeared as both a sort of force of the reconstruction and a sort of helpmate to commercial culture. So even as Umberto Eco was pointing to the architect as a prominent, respected figure, by the late 1960s, critics were calling out architects like Ponti and, of course, also Zanuzo. These critics observed that the buildings that appeared across Milan, such as office buildings, apartment buildings, parking garages, addressed primarily the needs of middle and upper classes. The 1953 master plan of Milan had ostensibly been a response to the need to repair wartime damage and expand into the former farm territory around the periphery. But the plan was predicated on the acquisition of land, which also favored individual property owners and business interests. So to early post-war architects like Zanuzo, involvement in rebuilding had been a positive form of participation. But to some observers 20 years later, the commitments of modern architecture seemed to have been betrayed. For example, Paolo Portuguesi in this article from Contraspazio in 1968. The conference theme Between Autonomy and Engagement provides a rubric under which to look at the concerns of Milan's post-war architects while keeping in view the contradictory conditions in which they operated. One could either involve oneself in the rebuilding and expansion of Milan at the expense of being subject to the system of building production, or one could remain independent from that system at the cost of being uninvolved in the city's actual transformation. My talk focuses on a single project by Zanuzo, the apartment complex on Via Solaroli, built in 1965, and uses this project to investigate the relationship between autonomy and engagement in this situation. What was the nature of the architect's engagement in this case? Did he give up his agency to work in a system that afforded him no freedom? And however that question might be answered, how do we know? To consider how the Via Solaroli apartment project was produced within the housing market, it's useful to situate it in the wider panorama of Milan. The city's character is defined by a mix of numerous residential, commercial blocks. There are major cultural and educational institutions, such as universities. It's one of the largest cities in Italy. There are important monumental buildings, such as the Milan Cathedral in the center here, and the Castello Sforzesco, another very large landmark in the city. There are also Roman ruins, but in many areas, the street pattern is still the same as it was in medieval times. The master plan proposed to reorganize and expand the center with new residential and office buildings along the axes of wide thoroughfares in specific zones. Meanwhile, formerly agricultural land on the periphery was targeted for development. Zanuzo's apartment buildings are located 3.5 kilometers south of the Milan Cathedral in the Vicentino district. And according to the master plan, a housing development had been built with rows of mid-rise bar-shaped blocks on Via dei Fontanili, just a few hundred meters to the west of Zanuzo's site, which was still a mixture of agriculture and industry sites at that time. From some distance away, the apartment complex presents itself as 2 rectangular volumes, each 6 stories high. The 2 volumes sit on a travertine platform a few steps above street level, and each is clad in travertine panels. Some of the units have balconies. These are inset behind the facade's flat surfaces. The cube-like proportions of the buildings, facades or buildings are echoed in the rectangular shape of openings on the facades, but there's a certain degree of variation in these facades. One type has recessed balconies, horizontal bands of shadow in which windows alternate with recessed terraces with dark bronze panels in between. Another facade type has half similar bars on the left and then a grid on the right. Each volume had a stair and elevator in a narrow rectangular vertical core, and the presence of the core is expressed in the facade as a column of evenly spaced windows centered and offset from the overall grid windows. Each building had 6 floors. Each floor had 4 apartments, and so there were roughly 24 apartments in each volume. Zanuzo's building resembles other apartment buildings built in Milan in a sort of global perspective in the overview of it, such as a 6-story apartment building by the architect Piero Bottoni, constructed in 1934, you see on the right. So just as Bottoni had responded to ideas about the sort of geometry of buildings and to the need of access to air and sunlight, Zanuzo followed suit and produced a building that's generally similar to sort of modern buildings in Milan. And so in short, it's relatively typical Milan modern building. It was on the edge of the city, easily accessed by car, though a streetcar would be available before long. Although these were apartments produced for the housing market, several aspects were unusual in that context. A number of these distinguishing features are associated with the developer of the project, the company Edelvar, which was headed by the engineer Giovanni Varlonga. One such feature is the constructive system. Whereas most buildings in Milan were made from concrete frames with masonry or tile cladding, in the Via Solaroli project, each volume is constructed from a steel frame with columns on a grid. The steel columns rise from the basement, where the 2 buildings share a garage. Each grid of columns supported a floor slab with further columns, like another floor slab, and so forth. Varlanga used commercially available steel pieces, but he had also developed individual components that would give the architect certain kinds of latitude in the design. The floors were made of concrete poured over a special metal mold that allowed for connection of the slab to the I-beams, creating a slab made lighter by being reinforced or thinner, reinforced not only by internal steel bar mesh, but also by the I-beams. Varlanga acquired several patents, including one for a connector that allowed him to connect the columns to the floors. Within the system, the columns could be shifted away at varying distances from the edge of the floor slab. You can see on the right, the column over the I-beam, then the floor slab is longer. And a close look at the plan, I'm sorry, this is not larger, shows that the columns don't sit on a perfect rectangular grid. They are shifted in some cases. So the system allowed the architect or builder to do that. And that is, for Zanuzo, provided a means to create the terraces. He could also freely compose the facades, which were a combination of stone panels, glass panels, and brass panels as well, or glazing. So these could be freely arranged since the columns were pulled back from the facade. The system that was used for the facades is a second distinguishing feature of the building. This was a curtain wall system produced by the company Fayal, which was also owned by Giovanni Varlanga. This system comprised a metal framework with vertical muntins and panels that could be hung on the system. This project on Via Solaroli was actually Zanuzo's second with Varlanga and using this Fayal system. On the right, you can see photographs of the project, their first project, which was built in the San Siro area. And like the Solaroli, used stone panels. Although the muntins are in front of the panels in the Via Leveno, where they're behind the panels on Via Solaroli. In the reception of the Via Leveno project, which was published in journals, unlike Via Solaroli, the way the system remained visible in the completed facade and had sort of modernistic characteristics such as clarity. You can see how it's put together. You can understand the whole assembly. The combination of these qualities with the use of stone, which made this building gave it a sort of dual aspect, being made by new methods, but also nodding to traditional building materials. Both buildings were also set near the center of their rather generously sized sites, not adjacent to other buildings. But the use of stone, even in that configuration, signaled the architect's aspiration for the building to be a valued addition to the urban landscape, even while availing itself of the latest technology. At the right angle where the travertine surfaces of adjacent facades meet, each edge of the building block has a steel piece and dark bronze finish that runs the full height of the cladded volume. And this gives a tactile quality to the whole, in contrast to its sort of masonry, solid masonry counterpart. And Zanuzo drew this detail even in drawings of the floor plans. A third unusual feature of this project is its expression of a connection between Zanuzo's architectural design of the building and his industrial designs for mass-produced furniture. In familiar narratives of consumer society, the product is a commodity, and there's a whole sort of culture of desire and perhaps compromise in which one can only afford a certain kind of couch or chair and may have to settle. But the way that Zanuzo approached the design of furniture pieces and envisioned their use was part of a different narrative. More than some of his contemporaries who were also engaged in design, Zanuzo used furniture to define rooms, not just to fill them. Drawings of the Via Solaroli project document his explorations of potential furniture layouts for these apartments. Here's an example. Desks, chairs, tables, beds, and built-in cabinets are all drawn. Kitchen and bathroom fixtures are indicated. Also, carpets, tile floor finishes, kitchens, and terraces are also neatly drawn, along with the stairs, elevators, and vertical utility chases. So these plans show that Zanuzo based the dimensions of rooms on a selection of specific designs, including his own chairs, lambda and woodline, and the table square, which are in use in this dining living room on the upper left here, mid left. So these were designed to fit together and to form alcoves and open areas, and Zanuzo fitted the walls around them. A photograph of an apartment in the building demonstrates how this would work. On the right side, one can see two sides of an inset porch. Its floor-to-ceiling glass is covered by curtains. On the left is a seating area with the chair woodline used to create the sort of edge of that part of the room. And on the right, across this generous aisle that allowed circulation, is the dining table with the chair lambda, also Zanuzo's design, and the credenza, also a design by Zanuzo. To those who would define engagement in terms of challenging the fundamental distribution of power and the prerogative over shaping the city, projects like Zanuzo's may appear as if indifferent to the bigger picture, although after all, Zanuzo accepted project constraints of working with a developer and designing within the constraints of a predetermined construction system. But Zanuzo's use of Varlanga's system can be understood as a form of engagement on various levels. For one, it allowed him to design in a very precise way relative to the labor of construction. Zanuzo had written in a 1946 article that the use of prefabricated aluminum parts would make for a construction site that was clean and dry and made limited use of heavy machinery. Varlanga's system gave Zanuzo that kind of project. In Varlanga's detail-driven approach to steel construction, Zanuzo had also found a way of building that resonates in observable ways with the work of Jean Prouvé, whose work Zanuzo had written about in a 1953 article. Varlanga's research, like Prouvé's, entailed revisiting basic facts of construction to design from the detail to the larger building. Zanuzo felt that Prouvé had arrived at a new aesthetic language, but in a way that the construction process was fully coherent with what he considered a civilized industrial society. And Zanuzo and Varlanga had concerned themselves in an analogous way with construction. Here's some photos of the Via Solaroli buildings during the construction process. Meanwhile, Zanuzo's parallel practices of architectural design and furniture design put him in the position to set the dimensions of rooms around a known set of furniture assemblies. These dual practices allowed him to engage indirectly with the apartment's occupants, for in the market, they would have access to the means to shape their own spaces with equal confidence. This extended not only to tables and chairs, but also to kitchens. The Via Solaroli buildings were suited to a commercially available kitchen, such as the one Zanuzo had designed for the company Elam. From these forms of engagement, certain kinds of autonomy followed for both the architect and the tenant. Zanuzo's use of Varlanga's construction system gave the Via Solaroli building a distinctive aesthetic, so the architects as well as the architect, the occupants as well as the architect could align themselves with the building type that was visibly different from many nearby apartment blocks, and also from the new buildings that were envisioned by the 1953 master plan that tended to be quite simple and rectangular and masonry buildings. Instead, the steel frames, curtain wall, and internal core of the Zanuzo Varlanga building evokes the international style sensibilities of American urban buildings of the time, exemplified in works by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill or Mies van der Rohe, which Zanuzo would have seen in journals or observed in person during his own travels to the United States in the mid-1950s. The placement of the two apartment blocks on the site was another deliberate divergence from normal market housing. The design of the Via Solaroli buildings emphasizes a connection with the landscape at ground level. These were apartments, not single-family homes, but Zanuzo provided a garden by centering the buildings on the site, leaving the perimeter of open space for landscaping that remained visible through the entrance porch and lobby. In the lobbies of Zanuzo's Via Leveno project, which uses the same system, he had followed a similar strategy. Meanwhile, the balconies on Via Leveno, in contrast to the Via Solaroli project, extended outward as terraces, and trees were placed there as well. This too reflected Zanuzo's longstanding interests. In a 1942 article, he had written that the ideal house would be on the periphery of the city, set in a pastoral landscape. He had revisited this theme in a 1953 article on Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation, which he praised for its provision of a life in proximity to nature. At the beginning of this talk, I interpreted the conference's premise between autonomy and engagement as a continuum between a pair of opposed values. One could say that architects in 1950s Milan had to choose between participating in the real estate market or not being involved in it at all. To certain Marxist materialist critiques of the late 60s, early 70s, participation in the economy was viewed as passive compliance. True engagement required autonomy from that system. It might be worth noting that in other voices in the same sort of period, the left was faulted for not having come up with a design strategy. And that kind of sophistication, let's say, would have required acquaintance with the new means. Zanuzo, for his part, had faced the unprecedented mode of construction. At least in Milan, it was not normal to build buildings with this kind of system at the time. And I would argue this was a way to put the architect in the picture. And similarly, the industrial design practice may have produced mixed results, but what I think is worth pointing to is the kind of position that the architect sought to have one foot in these two worlds. It did not lead to a repetition of this and production of more buildings like this, but that strategy might yet be meaningful in the longer term. So I've tried to show in my analysis how Zanuzo found a measure of autonomy by engaging in the design of market housing in the apartment complex on Via Solaroli. On this point, I've emphasized a few aspects of the project, and among the most important is that the developer in this case, Giovanni Varlonga, was also an engineer and a contractor. And the results of the collaboration between Zanuzo and Varlonga suggest that with a like-minded partner, even within the same prevailing system, one might find the limits of the market more flexible than otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shantel. Your investigation really brings other questions. It involves a different scale, different logics, I think, in response also to post-industrialization process. So, and I think it's worth also pointing out to the meaningful images that all presentations brought, especially the details and the photos of the construction process in your case. And I have to say, I learned a lot from all presentations. And after looking and hearing you, looking at the presentations and hearing you, I keep asking myself more and more to what extent can architecture really be autonomous? So to me, all three presentations show that architectural autonomy is fiction because it depends on so many agents, forces, beings, disciplines. So it's more and more clear to me that it's essentially relational, as Siza also said. So instead of thinking of engagement as opposed to authorship or opposed to status quo, we may also think in terms of relational practices of design. And as critics also, this is also our big challenge. Because sometimes we look at objects, still look at more at objects than processes. So I think we can open to the debate now. And I would ask you to raise hands or use the chat if you want. Fernando. No, so maybe you can start with you, Fernando.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking about engagement in terms of a wider frame, a cultural frame. And in that sense, I think that the project of Siza in Evora, although we can think of the fountain and the tree as elements of the context, I think the most powerful thing in Siza's project are the streets, the patios, and the typological design. The idea that engagement is
trae gente arriba.
That the engagement is with this collective knowledge, millennial knowledge of streets as the structuring parts of the city. And in this sense, I think that this is the strongest engagement of Siza's project. In the case of Zanuzo's project, I was thinking that those are kind of villas aligned with the, more or less aligned with the street. And they are sympathetic with in some way with the rest of Milan structure, which is, but in the case of the Ungers project, I think it's more inventive position for creating something completely new, even in this compositional origin of the project as of the smallest units, which are the rooms to be positioned as figurative elements. So that's my reflection on the three projects to be seen together in some way.
I don't know, maybe Pierre-Alain would like to comment or?
No, thank you for your comment. I totally agree with the importance of the street. And you know that the dimension of the street of 6 meters was given in relation with the historical center of Evora. And in the beautiful book was published by Brigitte Fleck, there's some comparison in photos of the traditional streets, even with the pavement in granite that you find in the historical center, and the dimension of the streets, so that Malagueira is the dimension of the public space has this strong connection with the historical city. What is interesting, it is the question of the cars, because effectively at the beginning, because there was population quite poor, and in the context of Portugal in these years, very few people had cars. And when Siza started, he said that he didn't think that people would have one-time problem of the cars. But cars came, and the inhabitants themselves decided that with 6 meters, by the fact they wanted to put the car in front of the home, it was not possible to have the cars on the 2 sides. So that quite spontaneously they decided to have one-way streets, and for example to park to the left and to have the right free, and another street would be the country, and so on. And this functioned quite well. The problem now is related with the way in which the streets seems to have very limited use as really a public space. It was for me a question, some difficulties for there's so many photos on Evora. In my own experience, I was 2 times in Evora. I couldn't take very good pictures because it was so strong summer and very hot. The light was not the best. But I used at the moment a photo made by Brigitte Fleck where you see cars and children playing in the street. This kind of scenes is more and more difficult. I made a tour this summer with one inhabitant who said me that Evora was beautiful in the time of the COVID, because in the time of the COVID, people used effectively again the streets for moving, for some socialities together with the park. It is quite interesting because unfortunately now people want to move only with the car, and this way of using the city as a pedestrian is more and more difficult. It has to do reflecting about clearly the change in lifestyles and the way in which the public space can be used.
Thank you. There's a big question here in the chat, Pierre-Alain. It's also for you. I don't know if you can see it, from Zilian Shen. Zilian, would you like me to read it, Zilian? Yes? So he says he has he says he has a question for you that has been troubling him for a long time, since his last visit to Evora. So here it goes. Although Alvaro Siza Vieira emphasized several features of his design, such as the use of aqueducts, the intimate dimension of the public space, the material of the streets, and so on. Sorry. Considering that the scale of this neighborhood is already comparable to the historical center of Evora. If someone put the plan of Malagueira and historical parts of Evora together in the map, it might be difficult for them to see their initial relation. At the same time, the body of the Malagueira seems to be almost a simple variation or repetition of certain type of one-family housing, which leads me to worry that it may eventually generate a neighborhood that isolated it from the historical city. This is especially concerning in the current context, as Evora is gaining new opportunities for development due to its tourism resources, while Malagueira seems to static, unchanging at the time it was built. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you for the question of the observation. It's a very complex question. The first reflection is clearly to reflect about the question of time. It's clear that Malagueira is particular by the fact that the construction was in more than 20 years with many difficulties, and even many parts are not completed, because you know that many public buildings and facilities and shops and so on was even designed very precisely by Alvaro Siza were not realized, creating clearly problems for the population. What you write about the kind of discontinuity with the historical center, is it really a problem? I don't think so. I think we need to reflect about the question of community. How is possible to think today that an urban form can create a sense of community? And in Malagueira, you have a sense of community, mainly by the fact that many, in the foundation of the city was a very important core of families organized in cooperatives. And even if you have a phenomenon of gentrification, this remains that even with the second or third generation related with this first core. In this sense, it's important, clearly, the occasion of the Capital of Culture in 2027 could be an occasion for offering to the population possibility to participate even in many of these cultural activities, for avoiding touristification. Like you have a partial touristification with clearly tourism for architecture, many schools of architecture, architects, professional, bus visiting, and so on. But we have to consider another aspect which is quite unique in Malagueira. It is that the atmosphere of the neighborhood is partially urban and partially rural. And this is exceptional. The fact that it's not only, we cannot say that it's not that Malagueira is a replica of an historical city, or the historical center. It is conserving traces of the rural activity. And this is very important if you think about the idea of a territory of a palimpsest, and the fact that you can conserve at the same time the rural memory together with some rituals of urban foundation. I think we need to speak about that because it is quite unique. But probably other colleagues will answer to this question, especially the Portuguese colleagues, if they are online. I would be happy to hear the answers about this question. This is a very important question.
There any Portuguese colleague that would like to add anything? Carlos, I don't know if Ana is still here. Antonio Carvalho. Go ahead. Antonio?
Okay. Okay, hello. Well, I'll just say very briefly that Siza wrote on a book about his works and about the Malagueira that a city needs time. So for him, it was very, very clear from the beginning that designing a city is not like designing a building, that when it is built, it's done. No, an urban design is something that needs to be understood not only in the concept phase, considering the time that cities take to evolve and to create its own identity, but also it takes time to build slowly, but also to get the interaction with the users. I think Pierre-Alain did an incredible presentation, very clear, very well documented, and very, very clear in the approach to what Siza did there. Of course, the city evolved a lot. I remember visiting Malagueira when I was in the second year of my studies with the professors from Porto, and Malagueira was still being built, and what it is now is the evolution of what was laid as a concept. And I think something nice that and surprising, I must say, is that people, the residents, adapted quite well without destroying it. The simple addition of the color, as we saw in a couple of the slides, was just a very naive reinterpretation of the local tradition of vernacular architecture into a very cultivated model, I would say. On the other hand, what was clearly explained by Pierre-Alain already about the cars, which was a very big problem at first, because as Siza also admitted, was not considered. People adapted without creating a big conflict on that. And nowadays, of course, the rural aspect is not so present because the city and the housing is very different. But I think what is important to me is that the urban design had a very clear matrix from the existing city, also from the local weather conditions. The courtyards make a lot of sense there, considering the climate and the use people do both on the streets but in the courtyards as well. So it's at the same time a very conceptual design and a very human design, and I think that is incredibly hard to achieve, and I think Siza did it, both in the housing and in the urban space. The way the open spaces were created, and now let's hope that the facilities that were not built, some of them, let's hope they will, and they will finish what is waiting to be done. Yeah, that's what I would like just to say. Thank you. Was long.
Thank you, Antonio. So we have Martin, and then you have Redmi in the chat, and then Wilfred. Martin.
Yeah, I have a question for Pierre-Alain as well, that may be related to kind of like this, the question of change and adaptation within a kind of certain formally strong project. And when I look at Malagueira, which had a sort of degree of incrementality, I guess, sort of built into its DNA, and if I compare it to other projects that take on this sort of incrementality challenge, such as, for example, Previ in Lima, one thing I notice is that Previ, no matter which design, if you take Sterling or other people, Atelier 5, they seems to have been transformed much more radically in terms of closing courtyards, building additional stories. And I'm just curious whether that, the kind of cause for that resides in something that the architect did. So is there a sort of agency over that incrementality that you would attribute to Siza in Malagueira? Or does it simply have to do with regulations and kind of cultural influences that are outside of the architect's actual control of setting up this incrementality?
Thank you, Martin, for your question. No, the case of Previ is very interesting, and these have been these very interesting studies made by some scholars, young scholars, on the transformation of Previ later, and some are effectively extremely impressive. I think it's a big difference in terms that you cannot compare the sociality in Peru and with social housing and with that of Portugal. And especially in a situation where one of the problems of European cities now is to have shrinking cities, even if Evora had important development. And the fact that the provision of Siza of transformation from 2 to 5 bedrooms gives, in any case, the quite important possibilities of changes. It's true that I didn't study clearly in depth because there are now more studies made by Portuguese universities about the changes. That in reality, only a limited part of owners transformed or implemented the house inside the plot, because many had, I think, in medium, many had 2 or 3 bedrooms, and very few after expanded. For example, because even we need to think about demography and the fact that when Siza started, probably families had a medium of 3 children or even to 4 children, and now probably the medium is 1 child. So that we have to think about it. What is important, I think, is that Siza gave this possibility effectively to adapt an evolutive house, but even with an idea that the building needed to remain with this density in the plot with only 2 stories. It was never thought that at a certain moment, if we think in terms of densification, some owners could have 3, 4, or 5 stories. You need to imagine, even in terms of relation between sun and shadow, what we would creating in the dimension. So that the model or for the urban design with it is a low-rise high density, but the idea that the scale of the building needed to be respected, the proportion between the scale of the building, the dimension of the plot was very small, and the dimension of the streets. It would be interesting to discuss this directly with Siza, but his reaction towards the transformation, internal transformation Croset, it's clear that architects cannot control the interiors, but it was important to control that the facades and the way in which the building is facing the public domain cannot be really transformed. And that is the reason for which when we visit Malagueira, we see a big diversity in the houses, in the way of the place and the gardens and the patio are very different, but you have this kind of architectural unity, and this is given clearly a sense in terms of identity of the architecture.
Thank you. We could talk about Malagueira for the next hours and much more, but I think we have other questions and other works as well. So Redmi wrote a question in the chat, and I'll read it. Don't know if Redmi is here, but I can see it. And maybe Martin and Shantel could also respond to it, react to it somehow, okay? It has to do with this issue that has been brought up about time and growth. And he says, it's sad that today works of architecture are not so architectural anymore. The freer examples are dealing with architectural fundamental topics, and they are all very good and interesting, but what about today? Martin and Shantel, would you like to start?
I mean, I can give a reaction to that question, maybe with regards to housing, because I've been thinking about that, obviously, and also kind of working in the context of the United States, where I think one thing that's driving a lot of the quality of architectural construction is actually not good or bad architects, but money and regulation, and especially for housing, and more precisely the questions of sort of what's called social housing or affordable housing, whatever you want to call it. The fact that a lot of it used to be publicly financed in the United States. So in the 60s and 70s, you would get, and that pretty architecturally amazing and interesting solutions, even in the United States. Maybe not necessarily socially sustainable solutions, because often it was segregated, and it was really sort of like its own thing that was spatially segregated from functioning cities. So, by the way, in Germany as well, like the Ungers project has a similar context. But increasingly in the 80s and 90s and now, all of this has been privatized, and sort of it's developed by people other than architects. So there's really sort of like a problem in terms of the processes and which generate housing. And there has been much more of a focus on the reform of those processes, maybe understandably so. And I think for housing, I don't want to say mass housing, but for multifamily larger projects that have a certain architectural ambition, there is that the territory has just become incredibly small compared to the 1970s, 60s, and 70s. And that's true. That's certainly true for Germany and the United States. I'm not sure if that's similar in other locations as well. That's one observation that I have with regards to that.
I think what comes to my mind in response to that question has to do with the sort of means of buildings. When I was working in an architect's office, we would design, let's say, a house, and then when it came time to build it, it was like, okay, well, is it going to be balloon frame, or like there were just maybe a few options, and they were very much conditioned by the contractors. There were sort of economies of scale that tended to shunt the architect down to the same way of building quite rigidly. So what I find actually exciting looking around the sort of landscape of practice today is that architects are finding materials and making projects with those materials, and sometimes able to like make them work even under tight economic constraints. What one that comes to mind is the sort of timber composite slabs, which actually gives rise to a particular sort of tectonics that maybe is unusual in contrast to conventional ways of building, or people who are building with renewable materials. I see a lot of energy and growth in those kinds of projects. And I guess I'm not sure how widespread it ever was. You know, like I talked about Piero Bottoni's anthology of architecture in Milan, which is essentially was a map of 100 or so buildings that gave you this idea of a kind of imminent multiplication of architecture projects. But that was, you know, that was perhaps an illusion. So I've kind of grappled with this question of like, what should we expect as far as how widespread architecture production is? But I've come around to a kind of appreciation for limited experiments that point to possibilities.
Yeah, Helen, would you like to add anything, or can we pass to Wilfred?
Yes, no, about the comparison to today, I wanted to have a more general reflection about the title of this session, with engagement and housing. I think that we need more and more to reflect about the urban dimension of housing. It is extremely important because more and more we see that the architects are no more considered or very limited actors for working together with the architectural design and the urban design. But what was interesting with discussing Malagueira and especially the competition project of Ungers, where we see that it was an idea not only of the cell or the building itself, but the relation with the urban design. With the example of Zanuzo, my reflection was that Zanuzo was a very important architect and designer, industrial designer, but it's clear that the idea of housing is more related with internal space, the way in which you inhabit the cell, because it has no really reflection about urban design. It was typical of this year because the same with Cacciado Mignoni or other architects who were working at the scale of the building with fantastic apartments, but they didn't really were active in this possibility to develop the new neighborhoods, because the new quarters were made, new estates were made more by planners than by architects, and after architects had to do the object. I think we need to reflect about that. And to define in terms of criticism when there are a few occasions where architects clearly can transform the city and can act as urban designers and architects. I think about some operations, because they're not really new, but for example, in Amsterdam, what made by Adrian Goeze for Borneo and Sporingburg estate. It's not the case, is a landscape architect, where the dimension of landscape is important in relation with urban design. The same in France, with some operations were made by landscape architects as Alexandre Chemetov or Courageux and so on, where it is an idea of the city. And I think this is very important. We think about housing to understand it's not a question only of the single building, but the way in which architects can effectively have some actions at the level of urbanism. The problem is clearly that is the decadence even of developers who are thinking only about the single object to be sell as an housing. This was my reflection in relation with the three examples we discussed today.
Thank you. I will add, just then I'll pass to you, Wilfred, just so I don't lose here. I think maybe a good reference here would be Brazilian architect Carlos Nelson Ferreira dos Santos. because he was a very important reference to the SAO program. And he has a very different approach that could be, also an important reference to talk about and to discuss in some other time. But he has a very important experience in Brasília, which is a favela in Rio de Janeiro. And then we are talking about a huge city, not a small city like Evora, but a huge metropolis. And where the design has actually disappeared. That's the idea. So that's it would be another extreme from what we're talking about. So feel free, it's to you, and I'll write the name here on the chat of this architect. So maybe if anyone would like to look.
Thank you, Anna. Key problem in contemporary architecture and urban design is that if we use the word housing, we already isolate those people who use that facility from anything else, and it becomes both for the users as well as from the point of view of the developers, and certainly from the point of view of the politicians, a monofunctional zone. So if you admit to be working in that particular realm of development without any kind of enlightened developer and politician, you are already not designing any city. So the word urbanity does not really, you cannot really, I don't associate with Ungers because of the functional framework. The conditions are not there. But on top of that, of course, Ungers' scheme itself does not define any urban space. It's just leftover spaces. And the only scheme that actually, of the three, that defines urban space is the traditional street that Siza designs. However, of course, then all you have is doors and some windows. And so the quality of the street in Malagueira is, of course, also somewhat diminished. However, to his saving grace, I mean, he did include public facilities in his design, and the fact that they weren't carried out is not his fault. So at least he was thinking about it. I haven't seen Malagueira since the car garages the garages were built. I can't imagine that they are really a successful addition, frankly. But I can be convinced. So, I mean, that's this issue. I mean, if you're talking about architecture and what are we actually expressing, or what is Ungers expressing? Well, frankly, if you look at Ungers' scheme closely, it is an asymmetric cross. He pushes one wing longer, makes one wing shorter, and then he aggregates these things. And then he gets essentially a linear structure with leftover spaces, and he has this pedestrian walkway paralleling a street. Well, the photographs, I haven't seen, I haven't been to the scheme, I must say, but it's a picturesque version of a cross. And it's interesting that Ungers was trying to get away from the picturesque much of his later life. However, this is also a picturesque adaptation of a cross. However he wants to put it. The thing is, can't escape from that at that stage. He becomes more radical later, and of course the house without qualities is the most radical that he could design for himself. Anyway, the Zanuzo apartment buildings are making, so if we're talking about historical engagement, Cologne is a denial of history, is a denial of urban fabric, because of various things, including German history, Second World War, blah, 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 blah. And, thinking that you can clear the slate and start anew. In the case of Zanuzo, of course, it's interesting that Valongo's construction system is a steel structure is a dry construction. And everything else that is to do with this thing is a dry construction. Well, I mean, I'm sure there are some wet trades in there, but it means, what does it really mean? It's a modern palazzo. What was a palazzo? It was a stacking of the orders. What were the stacking of the orders? Columns on columns on columns. Except that they weren't, in most cases, real columns, they were a representation of columns. So what is Zanuzo's, Valonga's building? It's a real stacking of columns. It's a real three-dimensional transfer of the temple, the Greco-Roman temple idea, into a palazzo. And even the expression is like a palazzo. It's a kind of cubic volume on orders, and then it has the cornice, except that it's an abstracted cornice. So, you know, you could say Zanuzo is actually the most classical of the three schemes. You know, the Siza is a vernacular version. Ungers is this kind of abstract idea of a cross, and Zanuzo, right down to the travertine, if I understood correctly, is an attempt to make a modern palazzo. And therefore he's engaging in this kind of history, and says, you know, if the fascist rationalists of the 30s were looking at classical typologies, like the Casa del Fascio by Herani, then I too can look at historical references and transform those into a modern construction. And he was helped by the engineer.
I hadn't thought about it that way. Thank you for that. One question that have been thinking about, though, and I think this is because I'm American, and here the standard dwelling is a single family home, or at least the reference is typically the single family detached home. I thought it was quite wonderful how Siza said that the house is a participatory project. You can always talk to somebody about a house because everybody knows this reference. And that's probably why American architects often design a house. It's their manifesto, demonstrating how they are going to build. But in Milan, the standard dwelling is an apartment, and across Italy, the single family home is, you know, only permitted for a few. So I think it may be worth reflecting on the significance of making a villa or palazzo made up of apartments, because that would be, I don't know, somehow trying to engage like a kind of popular housing type, dwelling type, with some meaningful symbolism.
But may I just point out, I don't know whether you mentioned it, that these 4 units per floor, they are connected, they're paired, right? So there's a smaller unit paired with a bigger unit. And there are 2 access doors, and they have a door linking the 2 units. In other words, one of the smaller one is a servant's quarter, and the other one is a served quarter. And therefore it's a high haute bourgeois lifestyle, right? I mean, how many people have their maids or their cooks or their servants live next to them, right?
I think it was relatively common, but I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, it's not a common social housing type, right?
No, but excuse me, Wilfried, this was common in Milan these years.
I know, that's what I'm saying.
Let's say that effectively there are 2 apartments, but they are really medium size, because if you see the apartments of Cacciadomignoni of the same years, they will see it will be really bigger, much bigger, so that it is. But the fact to have one person in service was quite common. And after probably a bit adapted can become kind of a small bureau or something. But the fact to have the double circulation was really requested, I think, by the developer of these years, because it was quite normal that you can have the double access. In some situations, you have even the double elevators and double stairs. In this case, it's kind of reduction of this double circulation plan that you can find in many examples in Milan. Probably the passage, because it is at the beginning of the 60s and after they will change at the end of the 60s. But probably, I think Shantel is working on that, probably in comparing with other apartment buildings by Zanuzo or by other architects in Milan.
One thing, if I can just follow up on that question, is that what's actually interesting is sort of like the status of the context in all of those cases. I mean, I think, you know, in a way, both Ungers and Siza try to reinvent a version of the city, wherever that comes from. For Ungers, it's the short circuit of kind of individual cell and city scale. For Siza, it is a certain taking up of kind of typologies and ideas of street that he finds in maybe the context of, not immediate context, but the context of housing types in the area. And the Zanuzo apartment is actually probably the one that's most object-like to begin with, because it only functions in the fabric, probably because there's a relatively closed fabric around it, and therefore the compositional form of that, Ungers would call it urban villa or palazzo, whatever we want to call it, works with exposure to light on all sides. Like the minute that tries to sort of like integrate itself into an existing context, it won't work anymore. Like that's, I think the Siza project, the Bonjour Tristesse, is another example of something where another architect may have done that and open up the corner in a compositional way. So I think there's really a sort of interesting dialectic between the kind of like housing type and what type of life that enables versus the kind of city and the context that is given to you by the city. And, you know, I think that's something where I would actually think, while typologically in America, and Chantal, you mentioned that sort of there are certain ways of scaling up this idea of the house. It becomes, in American suburbia or American cities, urbanization, it becomes problematic because scaling up from a single family house to a quadplex, triplex, whatever, doesn't change the essential makeup of the city. It changes the density, but it becomes a larger object on a lot now, instead of kind of like many smaller objects on a lot. And I think that's the struggle that I think Ungers was up against too, and that he was sort of like halfway buying into this modernist idea of they're all disconnected objects, but at the same time he was trying to counteract that and realize that, well, that there has to be something else that comes in here rather than just big objects on irregular blocks. And while that in the built version may not have been entirely there yet, I think this idea that the street is not something that's on the outside, because it's not given, but something has to come from the inside of the project itself. I think that was his, at least, idea for the built project.
Thank you, Martin. So, Wilfried, and then we don't have much time left. Those of you who are in the East, it's very, very late. But I would like to hear comments as well, because he made some comments in the chat. So after Wilfried, if comments would like to talk also, and then we close. Is it okay?
Well, my comment was rather short, is that, Ana Luisa, you said that architecture was relational rather than autonomous, and which is true. But it is also true that choice is always present in the architectural design process, so that in that sense, architecture has a degree of limited autonomy. And many people have argued convincingly, I think that Denise Scott Brown and Alvaro Siza, among others, that form also follows form. Form also follows previous form. And I would add to that form also suggests function. And I think that one of the problems with the Unger problems is really the corners. What functions do the corners in the Unger's block suggest? Which is more or less to say the same thing that Wilfried was saying.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a point of critique of the project, that it, I mean, I think for me there are some missed opportunities maybe in not necessarily in the corner itself. So I mean, the corner is interestingly actually kind of a version of the Miesian corner on a building, like a sort of like, and it has been, I think what to me is a missed opportunity maybe is to define that band that consists of the outer courtyards, like the kind of series of 5 courtyards and 2 corners, that has not really been defined as any kind of spatial or landscape concept in its own right? I do think the passages and moving through the building from one part to the next could have been strengthened conceptually as an idea by moving from a different landscape into another landscape. So I think the only differentiation that you have at the moment is the outside courtyards and the inside semi-private courtyard. And the main difference is trees, big trees on the inside, not so big trees or fewer trees on the outside. But I do think there is, for me, there's one of those opportunities where I think actually that differentiation of literally different worlds that you move through, I think could have given a completely different reading to that band of what now reads as leftover space in the good old German tradition of having some trash containers and a dozen signs of what you're not allowed to do on these patches of grass, right? So I think yeah, that's a good observation, and I do think that there's, in my opinion, there's potential there for something that's not quite realized in the project.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And before I pass to Wilfried and then Segu, just because you mentioned my remark as well, so I must say that I agree with you that, of course, architects have some choice. So, but I wouldn't call it autonomy, or I wouldn't value this topic right now. I think the topic that we must value is relationality. So maybe we should move on from this topic. That's my point. Move on from these divides and value things that are actually, for me, at the agenda right now. So this is it. Thank you. So Wilfried, it's with you, and then Segu.
As Sengul mentioned in the critique of Siza's Bonjour Tristesse, there's a lack of flexibility. And it's one of the most sobering realizations that the most successful building stock, I'm not using any other word, just building stock, was constructed by speculators in most countries of the world. So if you say that to architects, they say, oh no, that's terrible stuff and blah, blah. No, the Georgian terraced house, speculators, the Berlin apartment building, speculators. And which building types have been the most successful building types throughout the centuries? Buildings by speculators. Why? Because the functions were never specified. You could have a bedroom there, a kitchen there, the Georgian terrace house could be subdivided, etc. Just to cut the argument short, architects, especially the modernist architects, in combination with concrete, produced the least flexible building stock, with the results that they when they were built in the 50s and 60s with very low spatial standards, they become very mean, and so on. Don't want to repeat all that is known. And so one of the tragedies of contemporary development is the fact that we adhere to both functional segregation. We believe in mean budgets. We produce buildings of low physical quality. We are about to reject ecological protection because, you know, the green project is failing. So, you know, I can't leave you on a very positive note, except to say that there is a lot of speculative building stock left, and we should cherish it. We should use it. And of the three schemes that were presented, two were actually in the spirit of the speculative development, and they were the Siza and the Zanuzo. The Zanuzo scheme can be changed a little bit. The Siza can be changed quite a lot. And so, you know, if Shantel is going to have the next and maybe the last word, with the Quinta de Malagueira, Siza has proven that he can think about flexibility.
Thank you, Wilfred. So we must close now, and Single. So you have the last comments or questions. So please be.
No, it is. Mine is very short. Mine is very short, Anna. I think we are making a mistake here. I just wanted to say this. We started identifying the architects with their works presented here. I think this is another mistake. Well, it doesn't relate to the main topic of the conference, but for example, Wilfred, you started saying that he always studied with cross and this Catholic cross. In Charlottenburg, I lived right across his building, and this building was a court type. You see, there was no cross in it. I mean, it may also make us to take a wrong lead to the main argument. So we shouldn't be talking about the ones presented here, I think. We are overgeneralizing. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you, Single. Thank you. Thank you all. It's very late, so we had to close for today. But the debate goes on, the sessions go on tomorrow, right, Ruth?
Yeah.
So at the same time and place. Yes, right? So
yes.
Thank you all. And Ruth, comments, Wilfred, if you'd like to close, please go ahead.
Just saying that please come join us tomorrow, same time, same place, and to continue our debates. Thank you very much for Ana Tostões and Ana Luisa Nobre for sharing the sessions today, and for you all to be here with us. See you tomorrow.
See you.
See you tomorrow.
Obrigada.
Bye-bye.
Tchau a todos.
Thank you.